A child vanished into the freezing forest night, and not a single soul heard the desperate cry for help. Except for Ranger, the German shepherd once dismissed from duty for being no longer quick or sharp enough. But in the moment when every second meant survival or death, Ranger didn't wait for a command. Ranger chose from the heart. And when Tommy finally emerged, eyes locked in a haunting silence, it was Ranger, and only Ranger, who understood what the boy couldn't say. What shocked the entire town lay buried deep beneath the earth where Ranger chose to stop. The sky above Timber Hollow was veiled in a thin layer of mist, like an old silk scarf worn threadbare by time, gently stirred by the breeze as it passed through the solemn rows of pine. Jack Nolan parked his rusted pickup along the narrow dirt path leading to the old Miller farm, a place everyone in town now simply called the abandoned lot. The iron gate, twisted and rusted, slumped sideways into the knee-high weeds, half swallowed by years of neglect. The wooden planks of the main barn were warped and sun-bleached, arching like the bent backs of the forgotten. If it weren't for the anonymous call at 6 that morning, someone reporting strange noises from the old farm, Jack would have stayed at his desk, warm and far from the silence pressing against this place. Ranger leapt out of the truck bed in one smooth, grounded motion. The large German shepherd, thick black and dark tan fur running in a striking line down his back, landed quietly, ears perked, eyes scanning. He didn't wait for a signal. Ranger had long been used to taking the lead on his own. "Let's go, old man," Jack muttered softly, tightening the leash as he surveyed the scene. Nothing stood out. Just a collapsed barn, just as people had always said. But Ranger thought differently. Just as they approached the edge of the barn, Ranger came to a sudden stop. His eyes widened, nose pressed to the ground, and then, like something had switched inside him, he began to move, circling the perimeter with deliberate, focused steps. Jack followed, a quiet unease tightening his chest. Ranger never acted without cause. The faded scar on Ranger's left shoulder was the first thing Jack noticed the day they met, back at the K9 military training facility. "Injured in the line," the trainer had said. "He fears nothing. But when he barks, sometimes it's not a warning, sometimes it's a plea." Jack crouched and placed a hand on Ranger's scruff. The fur along his neck stood straight. The muscles beneath tensed like coiled rope. Even the air around them felt suddenly still. "You sense something," Jack whispered. Ranger pressed his snout to the warped wood outside the old horse stable. And then Ranger barked. It wasn't a sharp bark, not a signal. It was deep, echoing, laden with urgency that pierced the skin. Jack flinched. Ranger barked again, louder, then again. The sound bounced across the empty yard, slammed against the cracked barn walls, and scattered into the silence like a siren from the past. "Easy now," Jack said under his breath, pulling out his radio, but stopped. Could be a wild animal, or maybe a bobcat. But Ranger's eyes said something else. They locked downward, fixed to a point beyond sight. Then, suddenly, Ranger stepped back and lunged forward, slamming both front paws against the floorboards with force. A dull, hollow thud shook the air, followed by a thick cloud of dust. Jack bent down. One plank, just one, looked newer than the rest. Less moss. No splintering. Office. He peeled it back carefully. Beneath it was a narrow gap, just enough to let a scent escape. Damp. Acrid, not like any abandoned stable Jack had smelled before. Ranger moved in close, a low growl rumbling in his throat. His body so tense, Jack could feel the vibration through the leash. A breeze passed, and then a sound. Not a bark, not wind. Something faint, like nails tapping against wood. One tap, Then silence. Then again. Jack froze. Ranger dropped into a sit, eyes never leaving the crack. Jack exhaled sharply, standing upright, gaze sweeping the woods. Call for backup? Or go in himself? His mind flicked to that winter morning in '97, the one when Ranger had tracked a missing boy through a frozen forest. Ranger had barked just like this, and under that patch of softened earth. They found the boy, cold, shivering, but alive. Jack drew his field knife and started to pry the boards up, careful not to make a sound. Ranger pressed in close beside him. The breeze returned, carrying with it the scent of old earth, and something else, something hard to name. Dust drifted down like soft snow as a thin beam of sunlight spilled through the pine canopy, catching on the floor's jagged cracks. Jack pulled back another plank, and there he saw it, disturbed soil, fresh, shifted. Suddenly a whisper rose from beneath, faint, barely more than breath. "Is anyone there?" Ranger froze, ears high, his entire body tight, drawn like a bowstring. Jack didn't hesitate now. He sprinted to the truck, grabbed the crowbar, dropped to his knees beside the gap, and jammed the tip into the edge of the plank. With a sharp wrench, the board gave way with a crack, revealing the mouth of a small underground chamber. A wave of humid air rushed upward, thick with earth and the sour staleness of time. Jack switched on his flashlight and pointed it down the hole. A narrow tunnel, no longer than 10 feet, ended in a wooden door. Rusted iron handle, worn and clawed like something, or someone, had scratched it again and again. Tiny handprints marked the dust. Ranger let out a soft, sharp whine. "Stay in guard," Jack whispered, then dropped in. The dirt floor was damp, springy underfoot. Someone had been here, recently. He crept forward, hand brushing against the tunnel wall. At the door, his fingers touched the cold iron. He hesitated for one breath, then pushed. The door creaked open, a mournful screech echoing into the dark. The space inside was cramped, barely tall enough for Jack to crouch. His flashlight swept the cement walls, and then stopped. Movement, 5 children. 4 huddled in the far corner, limbs tangled together like trembling shadows. One, a boy, maybe 8, stood in front of them, unmoving, watching. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jack said gently, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a police officer. My name's Jack. I'm here to bring you home." No answer, just quick, shallow breaths, eyes wide, locked on his. Jack lowered the flashlight, careful not to blind them. Dirt-smudged faces, pale skin, tangled hair. On one arm, a rope mark still red around a tiny wrist. No blood, but fear and exhaustion. The boy stepped forward, his eyes, black and sharp, glinted under the beam like 2 chips of stone. "Who sent you?" the boy asked, voice steady but small. Jack dropped to one knee, level with him. "No one," he said softly. "Just a dog. Ranger heard you calling." Helen nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, I was just curious." "What does that symbol mean, Tommy?" The boy stayed silent. Ranger let out a soft, low whimper, almost like a gentle reminder. Tommy lowered his head, his fingers absently twirling the pencil between them. "I remember. My mom used to draw it," he said, his voice quiet and deliberate. "She told me it was the eye of those who don't sleep." "The ones who don't sleep?" Helen echoed, her breath catching slightly. Tommy nodded. "They know everything. They can see in the dark." Helen held her breath. "When did she tell you that?" "Before she disappeared." Tommy stared at the blank sheet of paper in front of him. She said if someone ever asked about the missing children, I should just draw the eye. A shiver ran down Helen's spine, a chill not from the weather, but from something unspoken sliding into place. Do you remember anything else? She asked, her voice now almost a whisper. Tommy shook his head. But I think the eye leads to somewhere else, where the ones who haven't been heard still wait. At that moment, Ranger lifted his head and gently pressed his snout to Tommy's knee. Tommy rested his hand softly on the dog's head, whispering into the quiet. He hears what others ignore. Helen watched them, a child lost between memory and silence, and a dog who had once sniffed out the truth buried beneath soil and time. In the soft, early autumn light slipping in through the window, Tommy's drawing no longer felt like mere lines on paper, but rather like the frame of a door barely cracked open, leading into something far larger than memory. A cry for help that was only now beginning to be heard. Just as she was about to ask more, Jack stepped into the room, giving her a small nod before handing her a thick envelope. This just came in from Forest Hill County, he said quietly. There's a missing persons report that doesn't match any names, but this symbol, he pointed to the copy of Tommy's drawing on the folder's cover, just turned up at another scene. Helen turned to look at Tommy. He was still sketching, pencil tracing slow arcs across the page. But his eyes were no longer focused on what he was drawing. He was staring out the window, toward the fading afternoon light glinting through the swaying pine branches, as if something long asleep was being stirred awake. Helen spent the rest of that afternoon combing through missing child reports. The Timber Hollow shelter had never filed a case even remotely like the one involving the 5 recently found children. She tapped into the inter-county system, sorting through every entry that matched the most basic criteria: age, gender, estimated time missing. The results made her blood run cold. Only 2 of the 5 children had official missing person files. One was Ellie, reported missing by her father 3 weeks earlier in Salem. The other was Mark, a blond boy, last seen near Miller's Pond Park in the Eugene area. The remaining 3, no names, no reports, no one looking, no digital records, no known relatives, no listed place of origin, not even a single identification photo in the system. Helen shut her laptop slowly, her gaze locking on the stack of paper files in front of her. She opened each one, cross-referencing details, scanning for anything that could make sense of what they were seeing. And then, her eyes froze on a single overlooked detail. All 3 unnamed children bore faint scars on the inside of their left wrists, the same spot where medical ID bands are usually worn. Bands not meant for children, unless those children had once lived inside a medical facility, or worse, a facility kept hidden. She stood abruptly and left the room, her steps quick and heavy. Jack was sitting at the temporary police station's coffee machine in the community center. Ranger lay beneath him, eyes half closed but ears twitching, still alert. "Jack, I've got something," Helen said, lowering her voice. Jack looked up. 3 of the children don't have any official missing reports. No family came looking. But all of them. They've got matching scars, left wrist, right where a coded medical band or a tracking device would go. Jack furrowed his brow. "Are you saying they were monitored like property?" Helen nodded. "Or registered patients, possibly from an unlicensed orphanage, some kind of underground care center. I need access to the state's internal archives, the ones that store historical records from closed care facilities." Jack was quiet for a beat, then stood up slowly. "I'll get in touch with Evelyn. If the mayor authorizes a federal data unlock, we'll get a backdoor in. But Helen, if your theory is right..." Helen met his gaze and nodded before he could finish. If it was true, this wasn't just a kidnapping case. This was a network, coordinated, systematic, and it had been around for a very long time. That night, Helen sat alone in the dim light of her office, pulling up each decrypted file from the federal archives. Many of the names were faded. Birth dates were either missing or suspiciously altered, patient ID numbers overwritten. Then her eyes landed on a short note, buried at the end of a redacted document labeled Contingency Program. Eye of Quiet tracks nonverbal response patterns, noted prevalence among children under age 10 with reduced sleep reflexes and heightened auditory sensitivity. Assigned symbol, circle-I-/. Helen shot up in her chair. She snapped a screenshot, printed the file, and rushed toward the children's rest area. The nightlight cast a soft glow. Most of the kids were asleep, except for Tommy. He was sitting on his bed, holding Ranger in his arms, sketching under the faint beam of the desk lamp. But this time it wasn't the eye. It was a map. Helen stepped in and slowly sat on the edge of the bed. "Tommy," she said gently, "do you know where the other children are?" He didn't answer right away. His hand kept drawing, finishing one last detail. Then, without lifting his eyes, he whispered, "Not everyone gets a name." Helen's hand tightened slightly on her knee. "Did you ever see another place where they kept kids?" Tommy gave a slow nod, then pointed to the drawing, a patch of land marked with walls, corridors, and a broken pipe leading out toward the woods. "I heard sounds from the other side of the wall," he said softly. "Lullabies, crying, but I never saw their faces." "And the eye?" Helen asked. Tommy was silent for a long while. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since his rescue. "It was everywhere. On the walls, on the clothes, on the metal plate behind the iron door." Helen held her breath. That last sentence hit her like ice. "Do you remember where?" Tommy nodded. "But only Ranger can find the way, because in that place—" He paused. "There are no human voices." Right then, Ranger stood up. No bark, no growl. Just quiet, deliberate stillness. His gaze locked on the half-open window, as if something outside had stirred or returned. "The dog?" The boy furrowed his brow, a flicker of doubt, not hatred, flashing in his eyes like a shadow crossing the sunlit surface of still water. "Yes, he's just above. If you step outside, you'll see him." The boy turned to glance at the other 4 children, then gave a barely perceptible nod. Jack pulled out his radio and called for immediate backup. While waiting, he stepped forward, extending his hand to each child one by one. The smallest girl let out a soft sob, her lips cracked and dry. Jack removed his jacket, wrapping it gently around her frail shoulders. The blonde-haired boy whispered, almost inaudibly, "We haven't eaten since yesterday." Jack rummaged through his pockets and brought out a protein bar and a small bottle of water, hardly enough for one, but the children shared it in silence, sip by sip, as if it were part of some sacred ritual. In that quiet moment, something felt off, a ripple beneath the still surface. Tommy's gaze. The boy hadn't looked away from Jack, not even once. There was no fear in those eyes, no retreat, no hunger, no thirst. He just stood there, still and steady, as if watching, as if measuring something invisible, weighing whether Jack was truly who he claimed to be. "What's your name?" Jack asked, his voice careful even. "Tommy," the boy replied. "I don't trust strangers." Jack gave a small nod. "That's smart. But sometimes, to survive, you have to decide who you'll trust." Tommy said nothing. Then suddenly, as if the thought had been burning at the edge of his mind, he asked, "Ranger, is he a K9 dog?" Jack's eyebrows rose. You know about K9s? I saw one. Once, a long time ago. Maybe in a dream, maybe for real. I'm not sure anymore. Tommy's voice dropped to a murmur, and his head bowed slightly. A little girl beside him, silent until now, spoke for the first time since Jack had entered the space. "My name's Ellie," she said softly. "We were just brought here yesterday." "Was anyone else with you? Anyone who brought you in?" Jack asked. "Just one man. He wore a cap and always kept his face hidden. He didn't talk much, but he had a gun." Tommy whispered. "He said this place was only temporary." Jack frowned. "Temporary how?" Ellie lifted her head, and in her eyes flashed something both unbearably sad and unnervingly resolute. "There are others. Some are being kept somewhere else." Silence fell. The kind of silence that makes your heartbeat echo like footsteps in a tunnel. Ellie continued, her voice quickening slightly, as if she feared the memory would slip through her fingers if she didn't say it fast enough. "Before they brought us here, I heard him talking to someone. He mentioned a transfer batch, something about the other group." "What group?" Jack pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Older kids, more than 10 of them," Ellie murmured. "They haven't been moved yet. They're still being kept somewhere." Ranger barked, 3 sharp, clear barks from above. Not panicked, not frantic, but precise. Urgent, like a reminder. Jack glanced toward the exit, then back at the children. "We need to get out of here. Now!" As he helped the last child climb up from the bunker, Ranger suddenly turned, his body twisting toward the left side of the barn where the tall grass began, and let out a low, guttural growl. Jack drew his gun, narrowing his eyes. Out in the field, something had moved. Not an animal, not wind. Something else. He dropped into a crouch, signaling Ranger to hold position. The dog stood firm, muscles taut, ears sharp, growl steady and deep like distant thunder. The stillness pressed in around them like heavy cloth. Jack backed slowly toward the children, motioning for silence. "Into the truck, now," he ordered, never taking his eyes off the swaying grass. Only when he was sure no one was approaching did he shut the doors, lifting Ranger into the front seat. The truck roared to life, bouncing over the rugged dirt path toward the town of Cedar Run. The children were nearly silent the entire ride. Ellie clutched a ragged cloth doll to her chest as if it could keep her from falling apart. Tommy sat in the back seat beside Ranger, his eyes wide open, not speaking, not sleeping, his small hand resting on the dog's back, stroking gently with each breath. Ranger didn't look away from him either. The dog's tail would flick at any unfamiliar sound, but each time their eyes met, no words were needed. Helen, the only social worker on shift that afternoon, was already waiting at the community center. Her auburn curls framed a kind face behind round glasses, and her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had weathered many storms. When Jack introduced each child, she knelt to their level, smiling gently, reaching out to connect. But Tommy didn't respond. He stood beside Ranger, his eyes like ice beneath the surface of a frozen lake. When Helen extended her hand, he took a step back, clutching the dog's collar as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had gone liquid and strange. Jack was about to say something, but before he could, Ranger lifted one paw, stepped closer to Helen, and sat. Tommy's gaze flicked toward the dog, wavered, and then, with the smallest nod, he said, "Only if Ranger stays?" Helen and Jack exchanged a quick glance. They understood. The bond between this boy and the dog was no longer just about trust. It was about survival. The next morning, Helen arrived early, carrying a few toys, a pack of colored pencils, and a fresh notebook. She sat down at the small table in the corner of the room, meant for special cases, where Tommy was seated with Ranger at his side. He was drawing, hunched close over the page, the lines of his pencil strong and certain, surprisingly controlled for a child who had only just stepped out of trauma. "What are you drawing, Tommy?" Helen asked softly. He didn't answer. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on the boy's leg. The dog's two-toned eyes were nearly closed, but his ears twitched at every breath Tommy took. Helen didn't press. She just waited, quiet and still. When Tommy eventually stood to use the bathroom, Ranger following closely at his side, she gently turned the notebook he had left behind. The paper was scattered with graphite marks, but in the center of the page, drawn over and over again, was a single image. A circle. Inside it, an eye. Sharp, knife-edged eyelids, a line cut cleanly through the pupil like a wound. Helen's brow furrowed. It didn't look like a child's doodle. It had intention, depth, obsession. She flipped back through earlier pages, the same symbol repeated at least 3 times, each time more detailed, each time darker. And in the corner of each page, a small dot, a mark, like a code. When Tommy returned, his eyes landed on the notebook. He paused just a beat when he saw it in her hands. He didn't scream, didn't panic. He just walked over, took it back, and turned to a blank page. "I don't want anyone looking inside," he said. His voice was calm, even, cold as river water. Outside, the wind had begun to stir the forest, rising slowly like a warning whispered through the trees, and somewhere, hidden within the heavy darkness of Timber Hollow, came a faint sound, so small it could almost be missed. The cold scrape of metal brushing against metal, echoing back from deep within the woods. At precisely 3 a.m, Jack turned the ignition. Ranger was already seated in the passenger seat, still and alert, his body quiet, but his eyes tracking every movement around them. Behind them were 2 vehicles from the federal tactical team, reinforcements dispatched from Forest Hill County. Tommy wasn't with them tonight, but before they left, he'd handed Jack a penciled sketch, a distorted, uncertain diagram of the terrain behind the old Miller farm, a place where Tommy said he used to hear crying coming through the earth. The forest behind the farmhouse was now cloaked in a thick veil of fog, the kind that settles deep and clings to the skin like old secrets. As soon as Jack cracked open the truck door, Ranger leapt down, landing without sound, and without waiting for a signal began threading his way through a moss-covered trail, nose low, shoulders shifting like liquid tension. Flashlights sliced through the haze like pale rivers of light, trembling with every step. Roughly 400 meters behind the main barn, beneath the older soil layer, Jack repeated to the tactical team, recalling Tommy's words. They stopped at a strange, flat patch of earth. No trees grew here. Grass barely reached ankle height, and the ground dipped slightly, almost as if nature had forgotten to tend to this place. Ranger moved in wide, slow circles, nose nearly pressed to the soil. Then, without warning, he snarled, low, guttural, and began digging sharply at one corner, his paws moving with forceful precision. "Here," Jack called out, dropping to his knees. As Ranger clawed away layers of dirt, a thin slab of concrete began to reveal itself beneath the mud and moss. It looked like any other piece of forgotten debris. But when someone shone the UV flashlight across it, a symbol appeared, barely visible under normal light, a circle, an eye, and a single slash. "That's the mark," Helen whispered, her breath catching in her throat. One of the agents brought forward the ground-penetrating radar. Within minutes, the machine began to hum and blink. "We've got a cavity under the concrete, over 2 meters deep, possibly a chamber." "Breach it," Jack said. The whirring of drills and the pounding of chisels broke the stillness. Dust and fragments filled the air. It took nearly half an hour to break through. Beneath the slab lay a dark steel hatch, embedded with a recessed handle. The lock had long since rusted. With a few firm strikes, the hinges snapped free. When they opened it, a wave of rot and decay hit them like a body blow. The stench of years locked away beneath soil, of things meant never to be found. Jack went first. Ranger followed without hesitation. The stairs descended into a narrow hallway with a low ceiling and walls lined in rusted tin and flaking metal. Each footstep rang with a cold echo. Flashlight beams danced across scratch marks gouged into the walls, and strange stains marked places where water had once forced its way up from the floor. At the far end, they reached a steel door, unlocked. Jack pushed it open. The air inside was thick, a suffocating mix of dampness and something sour, human, and long decayed. The flashlight moved slowly. 13 children. No screams, no cries, just eyes. Eyes sunken from hunger, hollowed by fear, stripped of everything except the instinct to survive. A small boy rested his head on the lap of an older girl, his eyes open but far away. Another child rocked gently on the floor, clinging to a torn sock like it was the only thing left that belonged to them. One had no hair. Another's arms were scratched raw, scabbed or infected. The air felt heavy, alive with quiet trauma. A girl stirred, barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" Jack crouched down. "I'm with the police. We're here to take you home." A younger boy murmured. "Last time, someone said that too, but they left." Helen stepped forward, removing her scarf and gently draping it over the trembling shoulders of the girl. "Not this time," she said softly. "I'm staying." One child hiccuped, then another. The silence cracked, like thin ice splitting under weight. The room trembled not from sound, but from emotion finally uncoiled. A tactical officer activated his radio, calling for immediate medical evac and transport. Jack began lifting the children one by one, up the stairs into the open air. Ranger moved beside them with every trip, staying close enough to feel their breath, to count each heartbeat as if it mattered more than anything else in the world. The smallest boy, no older than 5, was carried into the arms of a medic. He didn't speak, but as he looked up at Ranger, a tiny smile broke through the grime on his face. "You know this dog?" Helen asked gently. The boy shook his head. "No, but I saw him in my dreams. Every time I wanted to disappear, he was there, outside the door, and he didn't leave." Helen turned toward Ranger, now sitting still beneath the trees, eyes locked on the bunker behind them. The lights of the arriving ambulances filtered through the leaves, casting a soft glow across the grass, warm and fragile. Jack looked to the agents. "We need to search the whole perimeter again. How many places like this are still out there?" No one answered. Because from the edge of the slope, where the trees began to thin, Ranger growled. And in that moment, from the far side of the woods, a shadow passed swiftly beneath the lights. Jack's hand flew up, signaling the team. "Hold your positions," he called, already moving. His flashlight and sidearm drawn, he charged after Ranger, crashing through low branches and tangled underbrush. The narrow trail dropped into a slope of loose dirt, where fresh footprints were still clearly pressed into the rain-softened soil. Ranger growled deeper now, his nose pulling him faster, then sharply turned right, to a patch of upturned earth, as if someone had slipped and scrambled up. Jack dropped to his knees. Boot prints, large, tactical grade, bearing a unique tread pattern. The left heel showed a tear in the rubber, creating an uneven imprint. Familiar. He motioned to a special agent behind him. "Run a search on every current and former security officer who had clearance near the Miller property, within a 10-mile radius." "You suspect someone?" Jack paused, jaw tight. Then answered, Harper. Deputy Miles Harper, once the quiet, disciplined security officer for Timber Hollow, later promoted to Jack's assistant, had always been a man of few words and strict routines. He blended in, worked hard, never made noise. But most importantly, he was the only one who ever had access to the old land registry blueprints of the Miller property. Months ago, Harper filed a quiet transfer request, citing family matters. Jack hadn't thought twice at the time. Now he did. Helen's voice cut through the comms from command. Jack, I just pulled the internal access logs. Harper tapped into the non-active farmland database. Miller's section. 2 months ago. No official reason logged. Jack gripped the wheel, his eyes fixed on the GPS tracking Harper's last known location, North Timber Hollow, near Whitestone Lake. He also used to work in Forest Hill before he transferred, Helen added. Might have had contacts there. Jack's eyes narrowed. Forest Hill. That's where the first I symbol was found. A thread was forming, fragile, but undeniable. By midday, inside the evidence processing room, forensic analysts were dusting objects recovered from the second chamber. Among the smears of grime on the steel handles, they found a single clean fingerprint. It matched no one on any federal trafficking database. And suddenly, the silence surrounding Timber Hollow didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like something that had been bought and protected for far too long. But when Jack entered the sample into Timber Hollow Police Department's internal system, one name emerged from the screen. Deputy Miles Harper. The room fell into a silence so complete, it was as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. There's no more doubt, Helen said, her voice low but steady, like a thread being pulled tight. He was at the scene. He may have been the one who redesigned the entryways. Or the one running the whole thing, Jack replied, his voice colder now, like stone set into steel. By late afternoon, they reached Harper's old cabin, an isolated structure crouched at the forest's edge, like a secret that never wanted to be found. The door was locked, windows sealed, the porch layered in the quiet dust of abandonment. But Ranger growled the moment they stepped onto the creaking boards, then let out a single bark, sharp and urgent. Jack didn't hesitate. He kicked the front door in with a force that echoed like a shot across the trees. The house was unnervingly still, dust floating in narrow shafts of fading light, no sign of recent life. But on the living room table there was a folder left open, pages slightly fanned, as if someone had been reading and fled mid-thought. Inside were old maps, blueprints of Timber Hollow's underground tunnel systems, some marked with the same haunting symbols they had begun to fear. A circle, an eye, and a line slashed clean through the center. Several tunnels were unfamiliar, uncharted. Helen flipped through the sheets with urgency. These aren't standard layouts. This is a routing system, organized by waves. And look, every timestamp, exactly 6 weeks apart. Transfers, Jack muttered, breath catching. He divided the children into batches, made it easier to control, harder to track. Then they found another sheet, handwritten names and dates listed in tight, hurried script. At the bottom of the page, next transfer November 6th, Station G, 13 kids. Helen's hand tightened around the paper. Station G. No one's found that location yet. Before Jack could respond, Ranger let out a sharp, clipped bark, eyes fixed on a darkened corner near the attic stairs. A wooden board looked slightly misaligned. Jack approached, tapped it lightly. Hollow. He pried it free. Behind was a narrow compartment, just large enough to conceal a small military-grade radio, still functional, and transmitting a single, looping message. Station G is ready. The next cycle will move through the northern line, Rendezvous set for November 6th. Moonless. Jack froze. That was 2 days away. By the time Jack returned to the lakeside cabin, where he and Helen had moved Tommy and Ranger for safety, night had settled in like a weight. But something felt wrong before he even opened the door. No movement inside. No familiar sounds. No soft clatter from the kitchen. No sprinting paws rushing to greet him. Just the scent of damp wood and a silence that crawled into his spine like ice water. He pushed the door open slowly, gun in hand. The beam of his flashlight swept across the living room. Empty. Then, from upstairs, a faint sound. A restrained bark. A breath held too long. "Ranger?" Jack called, his voice dropping into a hush like he feared the air might break. Ranger appeared at the top of the stairs, fur bristling, eyes wide, his mouth parted just enough to let out a low growl, deep and primal. Beside him stood Tommy, still in his pajamas, sketchbook in hand, pressed against the doorway like a shadow. "What happened?" Jack asked quickly. Tommy raised one hand and pointed toward the back window. "I saw someone standing out there." Jack stepped to the window, parting the curtain with care. In the pale wash of moonlight, he saw only the faint trail of a long shadow disappearing into the trees. "It was a person," Tommy whispered. "I saw the badge. Round, with a star in the middle. It caught the moonlight." Jack's jaw tensed. "You're sure it had a star?" "Positive?" Tommy nodded. It looked exactly like a police badge. Jack's heart pounded. They had found him. Not just him. Ranger. Ranger growled again, turning swiftly toward the back door that led into the yard. In a heartbeat, he was gone, launching into the dark with a velocity that tore through the quiet like a scream. "Ranger, come back!" Jack shouted, lunging forward, but it was too late. 2 minutes later, a furious bark rang out from the tree line. Jack grabbed his flashlight, sprinted into the night, his boots striking the damp earth in pounding rhythm, the wind in the trees hissing like distant voices. And then he saw him. Ranger, rigid and growling, paw planted firmly on a fresh boot print embedded in the leaves beneath a massive tree trunk. No person in sight. But the faint scent of gunpowder clung to the air like a warning left behind. Jack dropped beside Ranger, hand on the dog's neck. "Good job, buddy." But Ranger didn't respond as usual. His eyes were still locked on something, somewhere invisible, something no one else could see, as if he were guarding not a place but a memory, a ghost, a promise. The next morning, Helen arrived and stood speechless when Jack laid Tommy's latest drawing on the table. It was the badge, a 5-pointed star, encircled, a perfect match for the sheriff's department insignia. Helen turned to Jack. "Someone inside the department is involved." "Not just involved," Jack said, voice hard. "They're clearing the path for the next transfer, to Station G." Helen exhaled sharply. "Then, whoever it is knows where Ranger is, where Tommy is, where we are." "They don't want anyone left alive to tell the truth." Jack's eyes drifted to Ranger, who now sat alert by the front door, his posture like stone, his gaze unwavering, fixed on the forest wrapped in morning fog. A moment later, Jack's phone rang. Internal line. On the other end, a voice spoke in clipped urgency. "We've detected unauthorized access to the security system last night. The IP is internal, but the worst part, Ranger's tracker, his chip signal, has been traced for over a week." Jack gripped the phone until his knuckles whitened. They're targeting Ranger. He's the one link they can't control. And just then, Ranger growled again. Not a warning this time. A vow. Somewhere beyond the mist, an engine revved. Someone had just left, slipped into the woods like smoke. The following morning, Timber Hollow gleamed gold under the rich autumn sun. But to Jack, The light only deepened the weight in the air, like fine dust settling into lungs that could no longer exhale. The town hall, a relic of stone and red shingles that once hosted spring festivals and chamber concerts, now overflowed with townsfolk, not to celebrate, but to interrogate. A community meeting had been called after an anonymous article appeared in the local paper. The headline read, "Sheriff Nolan and the K9 dog tarnishing the honor of a peaceful town?" The piece accused Jack of digging up ghosts, of targeting respected philanthropists like Mr. Richard Hale, and implied he was abusing authority to chase personal grief. And now Jack stood at the podium, alone, facing dozens of eyes that once trusted, now uncertain. But when Jack entered the sample into Timber Hollow Police Department's internal system, one name emerged from the screen: Deputy Miles Harper. The room fell into a silence so complete it was as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. "There's no more doubt," Helen said, her voice low but steady, like a thread being pulled tight. "He was at the scene. He may have been the one who redesigned the entryways." "Or the one running the whole thing," Jack replied, his voice colder now, like stone set into steel. By late afternoon, they reached Harper's old cabin, an isolated structure crouched at the forest's edge, like a secret that never wanted to be found. The door was locked, windows sealed, the porch layered in the quiet dust of abandonment. But Ranger growled the moment they stepped onto the creaking boards, then let out a single bark, sharp and urgent. Jack didn't hesitate. He kicked the front door in with a force that echoed like a shot across the trees. The house was unnervingly still, dust floating in narrow shafts of fading light, no sign of recent life. But on the living room table, there was a folder left open, pages slightly fanned, as if someone had been reading and fled mid-thought. Inside were old maps, blueprints of Timber Hollow's underground tunnel systems, some marked with the same haunting symbols they had begun to fear. A circle, an eye, and a line slashed clean through the center. Several tunnels were unfamiliar, uncharted. Helen flipped through the sheets with urgency. "These aren't standard layouts. This is a routing system, organized by waves. And look, every timestamp, exactly 6 weeks apart." "Transfers," Jack muttered, breath catching. He divided the children into batches, made it easier to control, harder to track. Then they found another sheet, handwritten names and dates listed in tight, hurried script. At the bottom of the page, next transfer November 6th, Station G, 13 kids. Helen's hand tightened around the paper. "Station G, no one's found that location yet." Before Jack could respond, Ranger let out a sharp, clipped bark, eyes fixed on a darkened corner near the attic stairs. A wooden board looked slightly misaligned. Jack approached, tapped it lightly. Hollow. He pried it free. Behind was a narrow compartment, just large enough to conceal a small military-grade radio, still functional, and transmitting a single, looping message. "Station G is ready. The next cycle will move through the northern line. Rendezvous set for November 6th. Moonless." Jack froze. That was 2 days away. By the time Jack returned to the lakeside cabin where he and Helen had moved Tommy and Ranger for safety, night had settled in like a weight. But something felt wrong before he even opened the door. No movement inside, no familiar sounds, no soft clatter from the kitchen, no sprinting paws rushing to greet him. Just the scent of damp wood and a silence that crawled into his spine like ice water. He pushed the door open slowly, gun in hand. The beam of his flashlight swept across the living room. Empty. Then, from upstairs, a faint sound, a restrained bark, a breath held too long. "Ranger?" Jack called, his voice dropping into a hush, like he feared the air might break. Ranger appeared at the top of the stairs, fur bristling, eyes wide, his mouth parted just enough to let out a low growl, deep and primal. Beside him stood Tommy, still in his pajamas, sketchbook in hand, pressed against the doorway like a shadow. "What happened?" Jack asked quickly. Tommy raised one hand and pointed towards the back window. "I saw someone standing out there." Jack stepped to the window, parting the curtain with care. In the pale wash of moonlight, he saw only the faint trail of a long shadow disappearing into the trees. "It was a person," Tommy whispered. "I saw the badge, round, with a star in the middle. It caught the moonlight." Jack's jaw tensed. "You're sure it had a star?" "Positive." Tommy nodded. It looked exactly like a police badge. Jack's heart pounded. They had found him. Not just him. Ranger. Ranger growled again, turning swiftly toward the back door that led into the yard. In a heartbeat, he was gone, launching into the dark with a velocity that tore through the quiet like a scream. "Ranger, come back!" Jack shouted, lunging forward. But it was too late. 2 minutes later, a furious bark rang out from the tree line. Jack grabbed his flashlight, sprinted into the night, his boots striking the damp earth in pounding rhythm, the wind in the trees hissing like distant voices. And then he saw him. Ranger, rigid and growling, paw planted firmly on a fresh boot print embedded in the leaves beneath a massive tree trunk. No person in sight, but the faint scent of gunpowder clung to the air like a warning left behind. Jack dropped beside Ranger, hand on the dog's neck. "Good job, buddy." But Ranger didn't respond as usual. His eyes were still locked on something, somewhere invisible, something no one else could see, as if he were guarding not a place, but a memory, a ghost, a promise. The next morning, Helen arrived and stood speechless when Jack laid Tommy's latest drawing on the table. It was the badge, a 5-pointed star, encircled, a perfect match for the sheriff's department insignia. Helen turned to Jack. "Someone inside the department is involved." "Not just involved," Jack said, voice hard. "They're clearing the path for the next transfer, to Station G." Helen exhaled sharply. "Then, whoever it is knows where Ranger is, where Tommy is, where we are. They don't want anyone left alive to tell the truth." Jack's eyes drifted to Ranger, who now sat alert by the front door, his posture like stone, his gaze unwavering, fixed on the forest wrapped in morning fog. A moment later, Jack's phone rang. Internal line. On the other end, a voice spoke in clipped urgency. "We've detected unauthorized access to the security system last night. The IP is internal. But the worst part, Ranger's tracker, his chip signal, has been traced for over a week." Jack gripped the phone until his knuckles whitened. "They're targeting Ranger. He's the one link they can't control." And just then, Ranger growled again. Not a warning this time. A vow. Somewhere beyond the mist, an engine revved. Someone had just left, slipped into the woods like smoke. The following morning, Timber Hollow gleamed gold under the rich autumn sun, but to Jack, the light only deepened the weight in the air, like fine dust settling into lungs that could no longer exhale. The town hall, a relic of stone and red shingles that once hosted spring festivals and chamber concerts, now overflowed with townsfolk. Not to celebrate, but to interrogate. A community meeting had been called after an anonymous article appeared in the local paper. The headline read, "Sheriff Nolan and the K9 dog, tarnishing the honor of a peaceful town." The piece accused Jack of digging up ghosts, of targeting respected philanthropists like Mr. Richard Hale, and implied he was abusing authority to chase personal grief. And now Jack stood at the podium, alone, facing dozens of eyes, eyes that once trusted, now uncertain. The first voice to break the silence was Mr. Kessler, the town's pharmacist for over 30 years, his tone worn but firm, drawn from a place of deep personal memory. "I don't understand how you could question Mr. Hale, the man who helped fund the hospital when my daughter was battling cancer. He saved her life. And you've barely been here a year." Then came Mrs. Merrill, the retired schoolteacher, her voice quiet but laced with disappointment. "I know what you lost, Jack. Your wife, your child. But grief doesn't give you the right to suspect everyone else." Jack didn't answer right away. He looked down, not at the crowd, but at Ranger, who sat at the base of the podium, still as stone, his amber eyes reflecting something calmer, deeper than the storm of judgment surrounding them. In that one brief glance, Jack felt the anchor he'd been missing, a silent confirmation that truth does not always need a majority. "We don't investigate because we hate someone," Jack said slowly, each word steady, deliberate. "We investigate because children were held underground in our town, and someone with power tried to make sure no one ever found out." A hand shot up. "Do you even have proof?" From the back of the room, Helen stepped forward, raising a printed document. "Hospital records, a concealed donation from 1996, linked to a medical facility that doesn't exist on the state registry. The source of the transfer: Richard Hale." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, but then Kessler's voice cut in again, sharper this time. "Or maybe it's just a coincidence?" The air cracked, like a frozen lake buckling under too much weight. The meeting began to unravel, voices rising, splintering. There were a few who backed Jack, but more stayed silent. And what hurt him most wasn't the opposition. It was the quiet betrayal of those who once stood beside him, now turning their eyes away. When the meeting finally dispersed, Jack walked slowly toward his truck. Ranger followed a few steps behind, the fading sunlight casting a long, stretched shadow of the two figures across the gray cobblestone walk. "Sometimes I wonder if I've lost my way," Jack whispered, not quite to Ranger, not quite to himself. "Maybe they're right. Maybe this is just me, chasing ghosts, using the pain as an excuse to go after the wrong man." Ranger stopped walking. Those amber eyes met his, not with judgment, not with doubt, but with the kind of quiet loyalty that required no proof, no justification, only presence. In that look, Jack found the one thing that still made sense, a bond that told him, "You are not wrong, and you are not alone." That evening, Tommy handed Helen a new drawing. It wasn't the eye, it wasn't a map. It was a man, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat, standing in front of a massive metal door. On the back of his coat, there was a police badge, crudely blacked out with pencil. And beneath the figure, written in the smallest, shakily drawn letters, "Station G is not the last." Helen's breath caught. "Who told you this?" she asked softly. Tommy shook his head. "No one. But I remember. Before they moved me, I heard someone whisper it. In a dream." Outside the window, Timber Hollow sank deeper into dusk. The clouds hung heavy over rooftops, pressing low with a silence that felt dense, unbroken. But far along the horizon, there was still a sliver of light, thin as hope, but undeniably real. Jack stepped out onto the porch, eyes tilted toward the darkening sky. Ranger moved beside him, settling in close. Beneath them, a fresh fax from federal headquarters lay on the porch railing. A satellite image, recently disturbed land. The note at the bottom read, "Zone G, confirmed active. Suspicious entry point detected at eastern coordinates." Jack gripped the paper tightly. His gaze followed the distant ridge that rose on the town's eastern side. A stretch of forest few dared enter, where cliffs broke into narrow ravines, and the old war-era myths still lingered in whispers. A place long avoided, a place long forgotten. "Let's go," Jack said. Ranger let out a soft, eager bark, as if he'd been waiting for this all along, then sprang from the porch, leading the way. By the time the pickup rolled to a stop near the trailhead, the last of the night had lifted from the treetops, giving way to the pale hush of early morning. Ranger jumped down, nose already working, body alert, tracking something invisible to human eyes. They moved for over an hour, over uneven rock, across tangled roots, through low fog and fallen trees, until Ranger stopped, his paws planted before a low cliff covered in thick vines. He let out a low bark, then began clawing gently at a mossy patch. Jack stepped forward, pulled back the vines, and his hand touched cold concrete. A wall, with a horizontal seam. A door. Hidden. Mechanical. Locked from the outside. Jack grabbed the crowbar. The door creaked open with a long, aching groan, the smell of mold and buried time hitting him like a wave. He stepped in. The space was small, stone walls lined with acoustic padding. Against the far side, rusted iron beds. On one lay a single child's shoe, a torn, stuffed rabbit, charcoal drawings smeared across the wall, and carved deep into the wall in jagged lines. Filtering. Waiting. "Secondary holding," Jack whispered. "They kept them here. To sort them." Ranger padded softly to a corner. There, beneath the dust, was a footprint. Fresh mud. A large boot. Left toe dragging slightly. Jack froze. That misaligned tread. Harper. No words needed. Jack gestured, and Ranger bolted, tracking the trail that twisted down a thick ravine, every step into the underbrush growing steeper, rougher, more treacherous. Branches snapped against their faces. The ground grew slick with hidden stone. And then, without warning, a gunshot tore through the air. The bullet sliced past Jack's ear, biting into his upper arm, sending him crashing behind a fallen log. Blood seeped through his sleeve. His hand shook as he drew his weapon. A voice rang out from beyond the trees, calm, mocking, familiar. "No one's supposed to come this far, Jack?" "Harper," Jack shouted back. "You really thought I'd stay silent?" "I didn't think," Harper replied. "I just knew you'd push too far." Another silence. Then, not a shot, but a sound. Ranger. A snarl split through the trees. Then motion. The shape of Ranger flew over the rocks, a streak of muscle and fury, straight toward the sound of the gun. There was a crash. Shouts. The scuffle of bodies. Heavy breathing. The thud of flesh hitting stone. Jack pushed himself up, clutching his arm, following the sound until he found them. Harper, swinging a broken branch, trying to keep Ranger at bay. But Ranger didn't attack. He circled, cutting off escape, herding Harper forward. Right toward Jack. "Stop!" Jack roared, gun raised. Harper froze. Ranger stood between them, chest heaving, but unwavering. Harper slowly raised his hands. I was following orders." "Whose orders?" Jack demanded, voice raw. Harper didn't answer, but in his eyes, behind the fear, there was something else. A resignation. As if this betrayal was only a piece of something larger. That night, inside the holding room of the station, Harper sat cuffed, silent. He had not spoken another word. The contents of his coat pocket revealed 3 items: a rusted key, a torn map, and an old keycard marked with fading letters. G2, Resource Management Unit. Helen looked at the map, then handed it to Jack. "This doesn't match the first Zone G. It's a separate branch." Jack stared at it. If this is G2, then Zone G is just one spoke in a much bigger wheel. "We've only seen the first floor." Outside, beyond the glass window, Ranger sat motionless, watching. listening. As the wind swept through the tall pines outside Timber Hollow, it carried with it a low, metallic groan. A door, somewhere deep in the woods, closing in the dark. The next morning, Tommy sat down to draw again. But this time, he didn't avert his gaze from Helen. He opened the notebook deliberately, turned it to a fresh page, and pointed at the newest sketch. A tall man in a black leather coat, dark sunglasses obscuring any trace of expression, drawn with only a few pencil strokes, yet somehow radiating an unmistakable chill. His hand held a gun, not aimed at anything or anyone in particular, just there, always ready, as if it were not a weapon, but an extension of his body, and a quiet warning that silence was the only safe response. "He's the one who brought me to the first room," Tommy whispered. Never spoke, just stared. Helen bent down, steadying herself, her voice soft. "Do you know his name?" Tommy shook his head. "But my mom. She mentioned someone like him once, back when she still talked in her sleep. She called him the gatekeeper." Helen froze mid-breath. "Did she ever say anything else?" Tommy hesitated, then turned to the next page. Not another figure, but the symbol again. The eye. Only this time, beneath it, 3 letters had been scrawled in a trembling hand. E.W. Helen shot up from her seat. In the dim records vault of Forest Hill County's old health division, she pulled every archived file she could find connected to those initials. And there, buried under outdated patient forms and faded memos, was a name. Elena West, a former biochemical researcher who had once worked directly under Richard Hale. Her personnel file noted a sudden resignation in 1996 due to personal circumstances. After that, she vanished from every civil registry. But on the margin of a document that had never been digitized, an unassuming piece of a medical briefing left unopened for decades, Helen saw something that made her throat tighten. A faint, ink-stamped symbol. The circle, the eye, the slash, identical to Tommy's drawing. And beneath it, a line from an internal memo, typed in the old machine font of lab documents. Bioreactive sample, EW, exhibits heightened resonance with alpha wave emissions from subject G. Maintain subject 5 in isolation. Prevent maternal contact. Helen gripped the page, her fingers trembling. Subject 5 was Tommy. She immediately called Jack. At the station, Jack skimmed the document, his fist clenched hard enough to whiten the knuckles. "So," he said through clenched teeth, "Hale controlled Elena, and he used Tommy to keep her quiet." Helen exhaled, as if saying it aloud made it more unbearable. "She must have discovered something inside that project, and they silenced her, forced her to disappear." Jack stepped to the table, spreading the township map wide across the surface. "He didn't just build a system, Helen. He built a way to erase people, physically and administratively. Each child, a redacted data entry, a file with no origin." "And Ranger," Helen's voice dropped, reverent, "was the one variable he never predicted." Jack turned to the window. Outside, Ranger lay curled beside Tommy, 2 beings from different worlds, bound together by something beyond language. And in their silence, there was the echo of everything that had been stolen. Names, memories, freedom. "We're going to expose every corner of this," Jack said. "Hale's entire infrastructure needs to come into the light." Helen nodded, unlocking her phone and scrolling to one of Tommy's earlier sketches, the one of the metal door, the eye at its center. She zoomed in, and there, etched faintly to the right, was a nearly invisible sign. Origin, distribution, filtering. "This wasn't a holding facility," she said quietly. "It's a coordination center. If we find this place, we might get everything. Every name, every child that's still missing. Maybe far more than the 18 we've already recovered. Jack reached for his belt, hand tightening on the strap of his firearm. Coordinates? Helen turned back to Harper's old paper map. In the far corner, barely noticeable, was a red ink marking, near where a dry creek met the cliffside. Next to it, 3 italicized letters, EW Link. Jack's eyes lifted. Elena left us an entrance. And then, just as Helen reached for another folder, a soft thump sounded outside the station door. The wind had blown something under the frame, a sealed envelope. Ranger growled, low and alert. Jack stepped forward and picked it up. Inside was a single photograph, the back of a child, hands cuffed, seated in a dark room. On the wall behind them, smeared in something dark and glistening, were scrawled words, "There's still one more room." Jack turned toward Ranger. The dog was already on his feet, ears up, muscles taut. This wasn't a threat. This was a signal. Less than 15 minutes later, Tommy was gone. His temporary room stood eerily still, the window left slightly open, curtains swaying gently. On the floor, a crumpled sheet of notebook paper, a single line in a child's handwriting. "If you want to find Mom, follow the path of broken wood." Jack burst out the door. Ranger raced ahead, nose low, circling the porch before letting out a sharp bark and charging toward the tree line. "Tommy's been lured out," Jack shouted into the radio. "Lock down the station. He's making his next move. Now!" The western trail behind town was already sinking into darkness. Ranger ran ahead, weaving through dried roots and brush, each stride filled not only with purpose but something deeper, the instinct of one who had stood too often beside death and survived by feeling what others missed. Then suddenly, Ranger stopped. A patch of freshly disturbed soil between leaning trees. Tommy stood there, alone, trembling. Jack moved to sprint toward him, but the moment shattered. A single gunshot cracked through the air, not aimed at Jack. Aimed at Ranger, the dog lunged without hesitation, intercepting the bullet as it tore through the silence. A rough, broken whimper escaped as Ranger collapsed into the damp ground, his body jerking once before falling still. "No!" Jack screamed, sliding down the slope, gun raised. From the trees, Harper emerged, eyes manic, coat soaked in dew, rifle shaking in his hands. "You should have left it alone," he growled. "You were never supposed to get this far." Jack fired, 2 clean shots. One struck bark beside Harper's head, the other shattered the rifle from his grip. Harper crashed to the ground, dazed. The fight was short, but it had changed everything. Jack dropped to his knees beside Ranger. Blood seeped from the dog's shoulder, a sideways shot, angled, tearing through near the ribs. "Come on. Ranger, not like this." Jack's voice cracked with something deeper than fear, a breaking he couldn't hide. Ranger's breathing was shallow, but his eyes, they remained locked on Tommy, unmoving, fierce, as if to say, "You're alive. That's enough." Tommy fell beside him, cradling the dog's head. "Please don't die. Please don't leave me." Jack didn't hesitate another second. He lifted Ranger into his arms, sprinted toward the truck. Tommy ran behind him, silent tears tracing down his cheeks. The only veterinary clinic in the region was at the end of Maple Street. A faint porch light still burned. A blessing. Jack burst through the doors. "Emergency! K9 officer shot! Needs surgery now!" Dr. Sylvia, silver-haired, focused, her hands already moving, didn't ask questions. She pulled on gloves and pointed to the table. "Lay him down. I need 2 minutes to assess." Ranger was gently laid on the cold steel table, his eyes barely open, breath shallow and uneven, each rise and fall of his chest like a fragile ripple struggling to stay afloat in the vast stillness that filled the room. The vet began to shave the fur around the wound with swift, practiced hands, nodding for the injection of painkillers to be administered, her voice calm, but laced with urgency as she said, "No broken bones, but he's lost a lot of blood. If we move fast, he still has a chance." Jack stood just outside the operating room, the crusted traces of Ranger's blood still streaked across his cheek, like a mark he couldn't, or wouldn't, wipe away, as though erasing it would mean surrendering to the fear clawing at his chest. Tommy sat silently beside him, clutching his sketchbook tightly, his expression neither fearful nor tearful, just fixed on the narrow opening of the swinging door, eyes locked with a kind of desperate hope that looked almost like prayer. Helen arrived moments later, her hand landing gently on Jack's shoulder, her voice low but certain. "We're not going to let this happen again." Jack didn't answer, because in that moment, the only image that filled his mind, the only thing that mattered, was Ranger, lying there motionless, and yet somehow still guarding something deeper, something more sacred than even life itself. The sound of a surgical saw hummed inside the room. The operating light still burned overhead. And then, Jack's phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He answered, breath caught in his throat, and through the static and distortion only a single sentence emerged. "The boy's mother. She's still alive." Jack froze, stunned, silent, but the call disconnected before he could speak. Helen had just entered the waiting room, her eyes searching his, a silent question hanging in the space between them. Jack simply nodded. "Any update on Ranger?" he asked, shifting the weight of the moment to the only thing his mind could still control. Helen shook her head slowly. "Sylvia's still suturing, but Tommy hasn't left his side, not even for a second." The operating room had since been converted into an intensive care unit. Ranger lay there, his large frame draped in a thin sheet, the wound now treated. Bleeding stopped, yet his breathing remained labored, thick and weighted like the silence in a storm's eye. A slender fourth line threaded into his leg, and his amber eyes, half closed, seemed to hover at the edge of awareness, as though holding tightly to something unseen and delicate, like a thread between worlds. Tommy sat beside him, not crying, not speaking, his small hand resting on the soft fur just beneath Ranger's neck, gently, rhythmically, as if trying to pass warmth from his own fragile body into the heart of the one creature that had never once let go of him. "I want to talk to him alone," Tommy whispered when Jack approached, his voice so soft it almost blended with the beeping machines. Jack nodded, stepping away without a word. Helen watched from the doorway, and in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, the shape of the boy next to the dog stretched long and tender. Two beings, different in form, but somehow, in that moment, indistinguishable in spirit. "You know something," Tommy murmured, leaning closer to the unmoving body beside him. "Back in that first room, everyone else cried. But I didn't, because I heard something different." His voice dropped to a hush, almost inaudible. "I heard your breathing, slow, steady, but warm. It didn't sound like fear. It sounded like knowing." He tightened his grip slightly on the blanket wrapped around Ranger's shoulder. "You heard me, when no one else did. When I didn't even have a name anymore. When they called me Case 5. Only you walked up, didn't bark, didn't flinch. You just looked me straight in the eyes." Ranger didn't move. Tommy blinked, then reached into his pajama pocket and pulled out something small, a torn, scorched scrap of cloth, embroidered with the name Tommy, its edges frayed, stained by years of hiding, of holding on. "I think my mom made this for me. I don't really remember her face, but I remember the way the cloth smelled when I held it in my sleep. And I remember the first time you sniffed it, you barked 3 times, like you knew what it was. He gently placed the scrap of cloth on Ranger's paw. "Now it's my turn to keep a piece of you, but you have to wake up, because my mom's still out there, waiting." Tommy's voice faltered. He swallowed hard. The bedside lamp flickered. And then, the slightest motion. Ranger's tail twitched. Not much, but enough for Tommy to gasp. "You heard me, didn't you?" Though his eyes remained closed, Ranger's leg tensed slightly, a small subconscious reflex, as if reaching back through the fog, drawn by the boy's unwavering belief. Tommy began to cry, not the kind of crying that comes from fear or grief, but the kind born of hope breaking open, bright and sudden, like sunlight spilling into a locked room. Moments later, Dr. Sylvia entered, scanning Ranger's vitals, then speaking with cautious relief. "He's still conscious, just barely, but he's responding to emotional contact. That's a very good sign." Jack stood outside the glass, watching. Helen leaned closer and whispered, "He's not just a dog. He's the first being who made Tommy feel like he was worth hearing." Jack nodded, eyes fixed on Ranger's body. So big, so battered, yet still radiating a warmth that made promises words never could. His phone buzzed again. A message. No sender. Just a single line and a set of GPS coordinates. "Where Elena's being held. Bottom floor of Sector G2. Jack clenched the phone in his hand, jaw tightening. Ranger was alive. Tommy's mother, Elena, was alive, and someone out there still needed to be pulled from the dark and brought into the light. He turned to Helen. "We're not waiting anymore." The estate of Richard Hale stood by the shores of Whitestone Lake, silent and imposing, the very image of old wealth and cultivated perfection. A mansion of gray stone and red cedar, its pathway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and cobblestone steps, once graced by politicians, philanthropists, and those the people of Timber Hollow revered without question. 9 a.m. A coordinated strike team from the FBI and state police moved in from 3 directions, their approach swift and silent, every step calculated. Jack led the rear team, his eyes like tempered steel, voice sharp through the comms. "No noise! Take him alive!" The moment they breached the back door with a silent charge, Hale knew it was over. He stood in the study, crisp white shirt unwrinkled, glass of wine in hand, eyes devoid of emotion, as if this was all some formal inevitability. "What a waste," Hale said quietly. "I thought you'd stop chasing ghosts." "You were wrong," Jack replied, snapping cold steel cuffs onto the man's wrists. "I was just waiting for the right moment." In the mansion's lower archive, agents uncovered stack after stack of files, coded notebooks, lists of children categorized by batch, medical reports, experimental notes, and maps marking transfer routes. Each page a twisted piece of the truth. Each symbol a child treated like a unit of inventory. Helen found a locked metal cabinet. Inside, maps of the underground system, including sectors G and G2, and a corridor without a label, marked only by one name, the lowest floor. "It's here," she said, pointing at coordinates that matched the anonymous message Jack had received. The team moved fast. Sector G2 turned out to be an abandoned warehouse east of town, masked as a charitable food distribution center. Beneath a false concrete floor lay a steel hatch leading down into the darkness. And at the lowest level, dank, forgotten, wrapped in mildew and silence, they found it. Not emptiness, but memory, pain, proof. In the far corner of the room, tucked behind a cracked wall panel, they found a broken wooden compartment, hollow inside, as if long forgotten. Jack reached in carefully and pulled out a tin box wrapped in layers of old newspaper, yellowed and brittle with age. He opened it. Inside lay a short, handwritten letter, a tiny necklace braided from thread, and a faded copy of a sonogram. The image nearly washed away by time. Helen took the letter with both hands and read it aloud, her voice catching with every word. To Tommy. If you're alive to read this, it means I failed in my promise to protect you. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single breath, not through a single night in the dark. I kept your face in my heart like a small light. Don't be afraid, my love. Follow the light, and always remember, someone is listening. Mom, Elena West. No one spoke for a long while. The only sound was the wind slipping through the vents in the old walls, soft as breath. Jack's eyes dropped to the floor, the tile worn, uneven, and slightly raised. Sylvia, who had accompanied the forensic team, stepped in, examined the area swiftly, then looked up and confirmed quietly. A female skeleton. Still wearing a bracelet, engraved with the initials EW. Helen took a step back, fingers tightening around the edge of her jacket. She died in 1995, probably right after hiding these. Silenced before the truth could escape, Jack said, voice low, almost reverent. By the time they drove back, the sun was high, but the light felt softer, less sharp, as if the world itself had just passed through something heavy and emerged quieter, more real, even if not yet whole. Tommy reached out with both hands as Helen gave him the thread necklace. He held it as if the years it carried might slip away if he gripped too hard. The threads were twisted in 3 colors, white, blue, and brown, the same colors his mother used to wear. He didn't cry. He only whispered, I heard her voice last night, in my dream. She left you something final, Jack said gently. Tommy looked up at him, and in his eyes was something brighter than tears, something steadier than grief. And now, Tommy said, voice quiet but sure, I'll tell the others. The ones who still haven't been found. Helen opened the old map again. Beyond G2, there were still 2 paths, faint and unclear. One led beyond Whitestone Lake, a zone no one had dared investigate before. Jack adjusted the strap of his sidearm, his face hardening. Hail was just the surface. There's a whole system, buried for too long, and still breathing beneath us. Outside the station window, Ranger lay stretched out on the grass, not yet fully healed, but the golden glint had returned to his eyes. Every time Tommy came near, Ranger's tail gave a small, steady wag, slow but meaningful. Their eyes met, the boys and the dogs, like the last 2 puzzle pieces finally fitting into the shape of trust. And then, the alarm from the federal network echoed through the room. Helen turned to her monitor. Signal detected in southern Timber Hollow, match code G-3. There was still another system to confront. But before that, Jack knew there was one thing he could no longer put off. 1 week after Hale's arrest, the town began to breathe again. Timber Hollow, long asleep beneath a veil of denial, slowly began to awaken. Families who had adopted children through shadowy intermediaries came forward, offering statements, confessions, regret. And in the middle of that quiet reckoning, Jack filed a petition with the local court. A request to adopt Thomas West. The presiding judge, an elderly woman named Sinclair, took her time reviewing the file. She looked once at Jack, then at Tommy, sitting beside Helen with a pencil in his hand, and Ranger curled beneath his chair. This child has no legal family, she began softly. But he has a dog that protected him with its life, a man willing to lay down his badge to become his father, and a doctor who confirms that the boy began speaking again only after being with these 2. Jack didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Judge Sinclair nodded, tapped her gavel once. From this day forward, Thomas West is the legal son of Jack Nolan. The small wooden house by the lake had been repainted. Its old, weathered brown gave way to a soft, warm cream. String lights were draped across the porch, glowing gently each night. Jack had built a handmade sign hanging at the front gate. A house for 3 souls and 1 hero. Tommy ran inside, arms full of new art supplies Helen had gifted him. Ranger followed behind, slower, careful, but with perked ears and a steadier step. The guest room had become Tommy's bedroom. Its blank walls were now alive with color, forests, slivers of light through cracked doors, hands reaching through darkness, and one large drawing of Ranger standing in front of the wooden house, gazing toward something unseen. Jack stood in the doorway, saying nothing, just smiling. In that quiet moment, life, once nothing but fragmented static, had begun to hum again. Not perfect, but real. That evening, all 3 sat on the porch steps. Jack poured tea. Tommy passed around cookies. Ranger lay at their feet like a living rug, eyes half closed. "Dad," Tommy asked, "if there are still other kids out there waiting, will we go?" Jack set his cup down, ruffled the boy's hair. "I think, when you know someone needs you, you don't walk away." Tommy nodded, then placed his hand gently on Ranger's back. "Then next time, I'm coming too." Ranger stirred, lifted his head. His gaze met Jack's, waiting for permission. Jack chuckled softly. "If Dr. Sylvia agrees, I probably couldn't stop either of you." Tommy disappeared into the house and came back moments later with a sheet of paper. He held it up proudly. It wasn't a map of G-zones anymore. It was a drawing of a home for children who used to have no names. It had an art room, a playground, a forest nearby, and tucked away at the edge, a small cabin just for Ranger. Its roof labeled with a hand-carved sign, "The First Listener." Night fell slowly. The kitchen light spilled outward, illuminating the page in Tommy's lap as he added new strokes to the vision taking shape. He drew with hands that no longer trembled, every line a piece of memory, not shaded in fear anymore, but filled with color. Beside him, Ranger breathed softly, his head resting on Jack's knee. He no longer ran between life and death, but held the role he was born for, the first to listen, the first to make a silent boy speak. The night wind passed gently through the window, but this time, it didn't carry cold. It brought the scent of fresh timber and a soft chime from the front gate. Someone had arrived. 1 year later. The Timber Hollow farm, once the starting point of a nightmare, had changed. The rotting wooden doors were gone, replaced by white stone paths, lavender gardens, and pine-covered walkways where silence no longer felt like fear, but healing. What was once the first underground chamber, cold, hidden, and hollowed by silence, has now been reborn as the Lightkeeper Memorial Park, a place not built with walls or gates or cameras, but with names carved into permanence, each one a child once lost, now found, now remembered. There are no fences here, no warnings or watching eyes, only simple stone benches arranged in a wide circle around a central space where the largest sculpture in the park stands, a statue of Ranger. Cast in bronze, the statue captures him in a stance both noble and eternal, standing tall, head raised, eyes gazing far beyond the horizon, as if still watching over something no longer in sight, but never out of reach. And at the base, hand carved into the dark stone with the care of someone who knew the weight of silence, is a single line. He heard the cry no one else could. This morning, just as the first sunlight crested over the eastern ridge and spilled across the grass like a soft unveiling, Tommy arrived at the park with a group of children from the shelter. The same children who, not long ago, had lived in the shadows of places like G2 and G3, now walking freely under open sky, each one carrying not just a name of their own but a story, a voice, a hand-drawn picture that now hangs on the walls of rooms they call home. Tommy stopped in front of Ranger's statue, a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. Flowers carefully grown around the edge of the old cabin Jack and Helen had turned into a quiet waypoint for newly rescued children finding their first refuge. There was a time when we had no names, no voices, Tommy said, almost a whisper, as he placed the flowers at the foot of the statue. But Ranger, you heard the things no one dared to hear. Not far behind the benches, in the shade of a tall sycamore, the real Ranger lay. Older now, slower in step, the years written gently into the graying of his muzzle, but his eyes still held that same unwavering light, the same watchful stillness, like a flame kept lit through storm and stillness alike. He didn't care much for noise anymore, nor for crowds, but today, of all days, he had made his own way to the park, choosing, without cue or command, the one seat that faced the statue directly, as if standing guard over both the past and whatever future these children would make for themselves. Dad said there'd be a surprise today. Tommy grinned, his face lighting as Jack approached with a small wooden box cradled carefully in his arms. Ranger lifted his head, catching the scent of oak and paper and the soft perfume of something cherished. Jack opened the lid. Inside lay a new leather-bound notebook, the color of deep forest green, and a pen engraved with the initials, T and R. For the stories you'll write, Jack said, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. Not everyone knows how to tell them, but those who've lived them, they must, so that even those who never knew can still learn to understand. And to care? Tommy opened the first page. He wrote his first line. Then he looked up toward Ranger and smiled. We were once the ones left behind, but not anymore. Ranger blinked slowly, then lowered his head onto Tommy's foot, settling into stillness once again. And in the soft morning light, their shadows stretched long across the gravel path, not as an echo of something gone, but as a mark of something just beginning. A journey not meant to end, but to go forward. When the doors of St. Elora Hospital slid open, no one expected the first to enter would be a German shepherd, large, covered in blood and desert dust, carrying an unconscious girl on his back. No one knew where they had come from, but the dog's eyes, locked onto the head nurse, seemed to be pleading, "Please, save this child." In that moment, the entire hospital seemed to hold its breath. And from there, an extraordinary story began, of loyalty, of choice, and of something so powerful it left the world in silence. Why did the dog act that way, and who was the girl? The sliding doors of St. Elora Hospital opened with a soft hiss, like a breath being held in the middle of the night. But what stepped through wasn't a rushing doctor, nor an ambulance siren echoing behind. It was a dog, a large German shepherd, its ash-gray coat matted with dust and dried blood, stumbled in, each step heavy yet defiant, as if holding up the weight of the world. On its back lay a little girl, small, unmoving. Her long brown hair was tangled with blood and sand, and one limp arm dangled down, lifeless. The emergency room froze. A nurse pushing a wheelchair stopped mid-hallway. A young doctor exiting a patient room stood still, and an elderly man leaning on a crutch halted, eyes locked on the silent spectacle unfolding before him. The dog walked forward. With every step, it left behind dark crimson paw prints, each one like a line etched across the silent horror gripping those who watched. In the sea of stunned faces, Alex didn't falter. No growls, no panic. The dog headed straight for the reception desk. Those amber eyes, deep, burning, locked onto head nurse Evelyn March as if saying, "Help the girl, please." There was no bark, but everyone heard the cry for help. Evelyn knelt without hesitation, arms reaching out. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here now. You're safe," she whispered, her voice soft like a lullaby balancing between life and death. Alex stopped in front of her, gently lowered himself down, and pressed his head into her palm, as if handing her the girl's fate. Then he stepped back, eyes never leaving the child. Her body was icy. Around her neck, a swollen bite mark throbbed beneath layers of bruised skin. "She's been bitten by a venomous snake," the ER doctor shouted. "We need antivenom, now." The hallway exploded into chaos. Medical staff rushed in. Room 3's light snapped on. Orders were barked over the rattling wheels of the gurney. But amid the storm, the dog remained still in the corridor, watching the doors that had just closed behind the girl. A security guard stepped toward him, but Evelyn raised her hand. "Number this dog. He knows exactly what he's doing. Let him stay." They named the girl Jane Doe. No ID, no records, but Evelyn didn't care about her name as much as she remembered Alex's gaze. It was the look of someone who had seen every shade of suffering and still chose to act. As doctors fought the unfamiliar venom pulsing through Mia's veins, Alex lay just outside the ICU room. No one asked him to. No one guided him. But he knew where he belonged, beside the one he brought here. His ears perked at every sound from the room. Each beeping heartbeat from the vitals monitor flickered in his eyes. Tense, unwavering, determined. A young boy in the waiting area, fresh from a blood test, pointed and whispered to his mother, "That dog's not like the ones at the park. He has the eyes of a soldier." Evelyn overheard as she held the still blank patient file in her hands. Her throat tightened. She had seen plenty: traffic accidents, cardiac arrests, even newborns delivered in public restrooms. But never, not once, had a four-legged creature made her feel like this, like standing before a comrade returned from the dead. When Mia was stabilized and moved to intensive care, Evelyn returned to find Alex still there, lying neatly, not moving, but his eyes still open. She knelt beside him. "Who are you?" she whispered. "How did you know to come here? And why her?" Alex tilted his head, then rested his chin gently on his paws. He didn't answer, but in his gaze was a strange intelligence, a silent gratitude, like part of him no longer belonged to the animal world. Evelyn gently stroked his back, fingers brushing over scars, thin, healed lines where a chain had once cut into skin. Just beneath the fur near his shoulder, she noticed a shaved patch, perhaps once for a microchip or a training mark. "Maybe you were once a service dog," she murmured, eyeing the thickened skin on his neck. "Or maybe you belonged to someone bad. But today, you did something most people would never have the courage to do." She smiled, a small, honest smile. "Thank you, Alex." The name slipped out, as if pulled from somewhere deep in her chest. And strangely, Alex looked up at that moment. Just slightly, as if he'd heard something from a world far away. Those eyes, deep like a canyon, glowing like polished amber in the glow of neon, were not the eyes of a creature. They belonged to someone who had seen too much and chosen to stay silent. Evelyn exhaled slowly, then stood. Before leaving, she glanced back one last time and whispered, "From now on, you're Alex. And I promise, you won't be alone again." And so, in a small hospital tucked in the heart of New Crest City, a story quietly began. One with a German shepherd who carried the gaze of a man, and a little girl who didn't yet know she had just been saved from the hands of evil, by Alex's greatest act of betrayal, one born of loyalty. Room 4 of the intensive care unit at St. Elora Hospital had never been quieter, even as machines hummed steadily and rushed footsteps echoed beyond the glass doors. At the center of that stillness lay Mia, the unnamed girl, motionless on a white hospital bed. Soft ceiling lights washed her delicate face in warmth. Her blood-clotted hair had been cleaned and now rested gently against the soft folds of a towel. A large bruise stretched from her neck down her chest, centered around an inflamed, fang-shaped bite mark encircled by purplish skin. Lead physician Cale Morrison stood over her bed, his expression focused and sharp. Beside him, 2 nurses prepared blood test kits and IV lines. Every eye in the room stayed fixed on the monitor. Each fragile breath, each shallow heartbeat, a flicker of life still clinging on. "This venom isn't common," Cale muttered as he examined the fresh vial of blood. "We're seeing aggressive tissue inflammation and internal bleeding, possibly a pit viper or a type of cobra, but the enzyme concentration is unlike anything I've seen." Evelyn, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, stepped in with a warm cup of water in hand. "Is it possible it's from a rare species? Something outside normal database profiles?" Kyle nodded, concern now clearly showing in his eyes. "We'll need a deeper toxin panel, but for now we focus on maintaining circulation and slowing down the spread. I'm initiating a combined antivenom and pressor treatment protocol." In the corner of the room, Alex remained seated, silent, unmoving. The dog kept a respectful distance, as if he understood the sanctity of this space, but his gaze never left Mia. Not for a second. One young nurse whispered, "I've never seen a dog behave like this. It's like he's guarding her." 2 hours passed. Mia still hadn't woken. Lab results arrived in Kyle's hands. After a quick scan, he raised his voice sharply. "We can't wait on toxicology any longer. Pulmonary edema is progressing. Prepare a high dose of DMSA." The room surged into motion. Pumps buzzed, IVs clicked, notes scribbled frantically. It became a symphony of urgency, written in adrenaline and hope. Evelyn gently laid her hand over Mia's. "Hang in there, sweetheart. If you can just get through tonight, everything could change." At that moment, Alex rose and quietly stepped closer to the bedside. He didn't make a sound. He simply lay down alongside the bed, his body parallel to hers, as if offering her the warmth of his own presence. Evelyn didn't stop him. She simply whispered, "Stay close to her. Maybe you're exactly what she needs most right now." Once Mia was stabilized again, a new problem became clear. No one knew who she was. Evelyn entered the admin room with a blank intake form in hand. No bag, no ID, no matches through fingerprint databases. This girl has no name, no family, no reason for being here. Another doctor asked, "Then where did the dog come from?" No one could answer. Alex wore no collar, carried no electronic chip. Which was strange. Trained dogs were always microchipped. But on Alex's left shoulder there was a small circular scar, like one from a chip that had been removed. Cale stood silently for a moment before saying softly, "I don't know what happened before Alex got here. But clearly, this dog crossed a long distance, carrying a dying child. That doesn't come from instinct. That comes from resolve." Evelyn nodded gently and opened her laptop. "I'll send Mia's photo and info to the National Missing Children's Registry, and I'll ask local law enforcement to check the outskirts. Someone out there may be looking for her." She paused, then looked toward the glass doors where the sun had just broken through. "In the meantime, let's call her Mia. We can't let a life lie here without a name." Kyle smiled softly. "Mia. Beautiful name. Let's hope she hears it and chooses to come back to us." That afternoon, Alex was led to a small resting room adjacent to the ICU. A soft mat was laid out, with a bowl of warm water and some food beside it. But he didn't eat. He simply lay down, eyes still locked toward the corridor that led back to Mia's room. Evelyn checked in on him, sitting down beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. "I don't know where you came from, but today, you brought light into this place." Alex didn't move, but after a while, he gently rested his head on her knee, a gesture soft and sure, telling Evelyn that in the midst of chaos and unanswered questions, there was still one certainty: loyalty. And in that misty afternoon, beneath the pale orange glow of a hospital hallway, a nameless girl and a dog with no past began a journey, not to reclaim what was lost, but to rewrite what was possible. At 3:27 a.m., Mia began to seize. The warning light on the vitals monitor blinked red, casting a sharp, rhythmic sound into the silence like the slice of a thin blade. Instantly, the emergency room burst into motion. Head nurse Evelyn, who had just stepped outside, rushed back in. Dr. Kale darted to Mia's bedside, pressing a hand to her forehead and checking her pupillary response. The little girl was trembling violently. Her muscles tightened, then convulsed. Her eyelids clenched, lips turned dusky blue. Around the old bite wound, veins began to rise and darken beneath the skin, branching like shadowed roots. "She's going into acute toxic shock," Kale called out, voice firm but calm, eyes sharp. "Prep adrenaline and magnesium sulfate. We need to control the seizure before it spreads to the brain." Evelyn sprinted to the cabinet. Another nurse fitted the oxygen mask over Mia's mouth, adjusted the breathing tube, and rapidly increased her IV fluids. Every hand moved in harmony, urgent, precise, unspoken. There was no shouting, only the quiet choreography of experience and shared focus. Outside the glass wall, Alex paced in small, tight circles. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, he had lost his initial calm. His claws tapped rhythmically on the tile floor, not out of restlessness, but from deep worry. Evelyn returned and injected the medication directly into the IV line. Kyle counted the seconds, eyes fixed on Mia's every movement. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the seizure stopped. The room held its breath. But everyone knew this was only the first wave. "This venom doesn't match anything in our database," Kyle muttered once the immediate crisis had passed. "The enzyme structure in her blood, this isn't from any known rattlesnake, cobra, or pit viper." Evelyn glanced at him, voice lowered. "You think it's captive bred?" "Very likely," he said gravely. "A rare species, maybe even genetically altered. I've seen similar neurotoxins at illegal training centers. But in Newcrest? In the middle of the desert? Why here?" No one had an answer. Just then, Alex barked, for the first time since he arrived. Not a growl, not aggression, but a clear, urgent sound, sharp, decisive, filled with warning. Both Evelyn and Kale turned their heads. Alex wasn't looking at them. He was staring at Mia's cardiac monitor. The waveline began to shift erratically. "Cardiac arrhythmia!" Kale shouted. "Get the defibrillator ready!" Before Evelyn could react, Alex leapt forward and gently tugged the hem of her lab coat with his teeth, pulling her toward the hallway. It wasn't forceful. It wasn't panicked. But it was deliberate, like he was trying to lead her somewhere. "Wait," Evelyn whispered, placing a hand on his head. "What is it? We can't leave Mia now." Alex looked straight into her eyes, an expression both sorrowful and determined. Then he turned and trotted a few paces down the corridor, glancing back to make sure she was following. Kale called out, "Evelyn, stay. We're prepping for defib." Evelyn hesitated. Her eyes moved between Mia and Alex. Then, something in her, intuition, instinct, spoke. "Hannah, assist Dr. Kale. I need 3 minutes." She followed Alex to the biological storage room. Unexpectedly, the dog halted in front of a low shelf holding rows of sealed vials and blood samples. He barked again, then dropped to a seated position, eyes fixed on a single vial containing a pale teal liquid. Evelyn approached and carefully picked it up. The faded label read, Specimen XRM/snake number 0341/test, uncatalogued. Her heart clenched. This is from the snake seizure case 3 months ago. How do you know that? Alex remained still, but his gaze never wavered. Evelyn rushed back to the ICU with the sample, and this time Kyle didn't question her. He simply nodded. If it's a match, we'll know in 15 minutes. Mia still lay motionless, her skin paper white, but the readings on the monitor began to steady. Her heartbeat found rhythm again. Her breathing grew deeper. Under the ICU's fluorescent lights, she looked like a seedling that had just endured a storm, tattered, fragile, but unbroken. Kyle walked over to Alex, who now lay at the room's entrance, head resting on his front paws. The doctor knelt beside him, held his gaze for a moment, and quietly said, I don't know who you are, or what you've been through, but today, you weren't just a dog. You were the first to spot the warning sign, and you acted before anyone else. Alex didn't respond, but slowly closed his eyes, as if allowing himself, for once, a moment of rest. The next morning, golden sunlight spilled through the ICU hallway windows, landing on Mia's tousled hair. She hadn't woken yet, but the tension in her face had eased, like whatever dream she was in had started to calm. Evelyn sat beside her, gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Outside, Alex remained in his spot, but now his eyes were softer, calmer, as if just watching her breathe was enough to make the day feel whole. That morning at St. Elora began with a brief meeting between doctors and local law enforcement. On the table lay a photograph of the bite wound, a topographic map of the desert, and a vial of unidentified venom, an unregistered toxin that nearly ended a life, and now stood as the only link connecting Mia to the world beyond. Evelyn placed a hand on the folder. We don't have any information on the girl's relatives, but there's one thing that still remembers the way back to where she came from, and that's Alex. Lieutenant Tanner Holt, the commanding officer, looked toward the German shepherd sitting quietly in the hallway. Alex's ears perked up each time someone mentioned Mia's name, his eyes glowing with awareness. That dog, he led you to the serum sample? Kyle nodded. Not by scent, but with deliberate action. We don't believe it was instinct. Tanner folded his arms, silent for a few seconds. I've worked with K9 units before, but a dog that can identify a biological sample, assess a patient's reaction, then act in real time to support treatment? I've never seen that. Evelyn spoke softly. Then let Alex lead the way. Not because we're out of options, but because maybe he is the right one. Later that afternoon, a small search team was assembled. 2 officers, a rescue worker, Evelyn, the only person Alex trusted, and 1 rugged SUV. Before they left, Evelyn knelt and clipped a small tracker to Alex's collar. We're going somewhere far, aren't we? She whispered. Alex lowered his ears, then licked her hand gently. No further words were needed. Everyone knew. He was ready. The SUV roared westward across the blistering sands beyond New Crest, where old trails vanished into desert haze like threads unraveling. The sun burned red as it sank behind the hills, painting the landscape in scorched copper. Alex sat beside Evelyn in the back seat, eyes fixed on the passing horizon. Whenever the vehicle turned the wrong direction, he would rise, lean forward, and growl softly. After the second correction, Tanner sighed. I don't think I'm driving anymore. I'm chauffeuring a 4-legged commander. Evelyn smiled, but her heart thudded with a quiet urgency. She had never felt anything quite like this, trusting a dog as if he were a living compass. When dusk finally swallowed the horizon, Alex suddenly pawed at the window. Tanner hit the brakes, and everyone climbed out. In front of them lay a low ridge, its base scattered with disturbed sand, human footprints, drag marks, and paw prints. "He remembers the exact way back?" the rescue worker murmured in disbelief. Alex began to run, not too fast, just enough for the team to keep pace. His nose skimmed close to the ground, ears alert, tail flicking with rhythmic control, every movement precise like a seasoned service dog on mission. After nearly 2 hours of crossing hot dunes, loose gravel, and scattered cacti, the team halted at a hollowed cliffside. There were no paths left, no signs of life, only a narrow crevice hidden behind brittle branches and awkwardly stacked rocks. Alex scratched at the stones, barking loudly. "We need light," Tanner instructed. One officer switched on a high-powered flashlight and aimed it into the crevice. The beam revealed a tight, dark passage, just tall enough for someone to crouch and squeeze through. The rescue worker tested the air. "There's a faint airflow. Might be a hollow space behind." Evelyn crouched beside Alex. "This is where you found Mia, isn't it?" Alex nodded faintly. It wasn't guesswork. It wasn't confusion. His gesture was too intentional. "Let's go," Tanner ordered, pulling on his headlamp. "We'll scout inside first. Stay shallow, stay safe." One by one, they crawled through the narrow gap. The air inside was cooler, denser, but breathable. Alex led the way without hesitation. As they moved deeper, the passage gradually widened until it opened into a small artificial cavern. Inside were traces of habitation, a worn blanket, a few cans of dry food, a rust-stained bowl of water, and a chain. On the wall, scribbled over and over in uneven writing, was a single name: Mia. Evelyn shivered. "She was here." Just then, Alex darted to the corner, where a rusted metal box sat buried beneath debris. He barked, then bit lightly at the lid. Tanner opened it. Inside lay a knife, a length of bloodied chain, and a child's necklace. A small star-shaped pendant. "This is bigger than we thought," Tanner muttered, eyes darkening. "This might have been a staging point for trafficking." Evelyn picked up the necklace. "Mia wore this. I saw it in the old ultrasound photo her mother kept." Her voice faltered. "We need to report this and get investigators out here immediately." Alex stood beside her, tension fading from his body, as if the first part of a long journey had just come to an end. On the drive back, the moon rose high, casting soft silver over the dunes. The SUV rolled across the desert, its tires carving a quiet path through the night. Behind them, a trail of footprints. Ahead, a little girl in a hospital bed, waiting to reclaim her name. And beside her, a dog who never tired, carrying the memory of a place where truth had once been buried. St. Elora was no longer just a place for healing. It had become the beginning of something new, rebirth, through the silent loyalty of a creature who refused to give up. The sky still held its cold blue-gray hue when the team returned to the desert at dawn. Dust swirled in the wind, coating the windshield like a veil of memories no one wanted to disturb. But Alex, sitting tall in the back seat, never shifted his gaze, as if a part of him was still calling back to that place, quietly erased from human maps. "We're close," Evelyn said, resting her hand on his neck. "That dark crevice last night, it was just the side door. This time we're going in through the front." The path leading down the ravine was steep, narrow, and unforgiving. No signs, no markers, everything concealed by the dry silence of the land itself. But Alex guided them with certainty, each step sure, each turn familiar, like he remembered every stone, every gust of wind that once passed through. At the end of the stone passage, the terrain opened into a flat clearing. There, a hidden compound lay silently at the heart of the desert. No metal roofs, no green tarps, just crude wooden structures pressed against the rock wall, forming a closed crescent like a world cut off from everything else. "Oh God," one young officer breathed as the first beam of light swept across the space. "This isn't a temporary shelter. This was built with intention." Evelyn stepped quietly out of the vehicle, her boots sinking slightly into the soft sand still marked by tiny footprints, as if someone had only just left. Alex froze at an entrance, refusing to move forward. Instead, he let out a soft bark and then dropped to the ground, his body low and alert. Inside the compound, scattered fragments slowly came together into a chilling picture. The first room was a crude wooden hut. A torn cotton mattress lay across the floor, strewn with animal hair and a few crumpled children's shirts. On the left wall, a row of tally marks had been carved into the planks with a nail. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. The count stopped at Day 48. Behind the hut was an open courtyard where 3 large metal cages stood. 2 were ajar. The third remained locked. Inside was a dirty blanket, a few packs of stale crackers, and a stuffed bear missing both eyes. "There are clear signs children were kept here," Tanner said grimly, his hand tightening on the flashlight. "This setup, it was meant for long-term containment, not short stays." Alex circled the cages, nose close to the ground, then began scratching at one corner. Evelyn knelt beside him and unearthed a clump of damp dirt buried under a layer of gravel. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper, scribbled in shaky, childlike handwriting. "My name is Kai. I don't remember how long I've been here, but if anyone finds this, please find my mom. Her name is Rosa." Evelyn's hand trembled as she held the note. "This place, it wasn't just Mia. There were more." Deeper inside the central building, they entered a room that looked altogether different. A makeshift laboratory. A wooden table was cluttered with bottles, test tubes, and gas tubing. In the corner, an old refrigerator hummed faintly. Inside were several vials of murky brown liquid, and a set of X-ray scans of snakes. "I've seen this setup before," one officer muttered. "They were breeding or modifying venomous snakes for private use." Evelyn exhaled sharply. "Not private, for control. They used the snakes to manipulate the kids." On the far wall hung a large hand-drawn chart, names written in red ink. Mia, Kai, Lauren, Eli, Nora. Each name was tagged with a code, and beneath it, toxin response, psychological notes. The entire team fell silent. Alex growled low, a sharp sound that sliced through the still air. He stepped toward a closed door and nudged it gently with his paw. Tanner opened it. Inside was a tiny room, no bigger than a mattress. Long claw marks scratched along one wall, and a faint child-sized handprint, pressed in dirt, was barely visible. Evelyn couldn't stop the tears. Mia was locked in here. As the sun dipped behind the cliffs, the search team finished documenting the scene and collecting evidence. No one spoke on the way out. The silence wasn't frightening. It was reverence, the only way to honor the children who had once existed in this forgotten place. Alex was the last to leave. Before turning away, he looked back one final time. His gaze wasn't angry, but sorrowful. The sorrow of a creature who had witnessed darkness, and still chosen to walk toward the light. Evelyn bent down and whispered into his ear, "We'll find out everything. For Mia, and for the others." And as the vehicles pulled away from the ravine, a gentle wind swept through the compound, carrying away dust, memories, and the echoes of laughter that had once been imprisoned. But this time, footsteps had returned. And a dog, still moving forward without ever looking back. Soft morning light slipped through the sheer white curtain, casting delicate strands across the corner of Mia's closed eyelids, like threads of silk gently waking a dream that had lingered too long. The heart monitor beeped in a calm, steady rhythm, no alarms, no hurried footsteps down the hall, only the stillness of a peaceful morning, slow and quiet and safe. Evelyn sat beside the bed, fingers gently wrapped around Mia's tiny wrist, feeling the faint but steady pulse beneath her touch. Alex lay at the foot of the bed, head resting on his paws, ears down but eyes fixed on every breath the little girl took. And then, the slightest movement. Mia's eyelids trembled, her lashes fluttered like young grass touched by wind. A small frown formed between her brows as she inhaled deeply. The hand beneath Evelyn's shifted. "Mia?" Evelyn whispered, like calling a sprout back into the light. Two small eyes opened, slowly, unfocused at first, but then gradually sharpening with awareness. Mia stared at the ceiling, then turned her gaze to the side. And when her eyes found Alex, something unexpected happened. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't joy. It was caution. She raised her other hand, weak but deliberate, and pointed toward the dog, her voice rough and barely audible. He's not my dog." The room went so still Evelyn could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. She leaned in gently, her voice soft. "Do you remember your name?" Mia blinked once. "Mia. My name is Mia Ellison, and that dog?" Evelyn gestured toward Alex, who had now sat up, gaze locked on the little girl. Mia slowly shook her head. I know him, but he's not mine. He belonged to the bad people." Evelyn held her breath. "Then why did he save you?" Mia looked at Alex, meeting those amber eyes for the first time without fear, but also without warmth. She answered quietly, "I don't know." But he was scared. Then he broke the chain, and he ran. News that Mia had woken brought a new energy to the hospital. Kyle entered the room with a social worker. After checking her vitals and noting signs of recovery, they asked Evelyn for a few minutes alone with the girl. Alex stood at the door, ears perked with every sound. Evelyn placed a hand on his head and whispered, "She doesn't remember who you belonged to. But you're still here, aren't you?" Alex didn't move, but his eyes remained fixed through the crack in the door, steadfast and silent, as if waiting for something more certain than memory. Inside, Mia spoke slowly, haltingly, fragments of memory long buried now beginning to leak through like drops of water carving through stone. "I was in a place with cliffs, smoke, and damp dirt. I remember the sound of snakes, that slithering noise." "Were you there alone?" "No, there were others, but I don't remember their faces. I remember a dog. At first he barked a lot, loud and angry, but later, when I cried, he turned away. He didn't bark anymore. Then, once I was punished. They put a snake in my room." She trembled. Kyle nodded gently. "You're safe now, Mia. Take your time." "I cried a lot, and then I saw the dog's eyes. Through the door, they looked different, like he was scared too." "What happened after that?" "That night I woke up. The door was open. He was standing there. He didn't bark, didn't run. He just looked at me. I followed him. We ran for a long time. Through sand, through thorns. Then I passed out." Mia stared out the window. Her voice drifted like it came from someplace far away. "When I woke up, I was here." When Mia finished, Evelyn stepped back into the room. In her hand was a small notebook where she'd written down everything important from her journey with Alex. She sat beside the bed, placed the notebook on the table, and asked gently, Would you like to see him again?" Mia stayed silent, eyes fixed on the door. Then she nodded softly. Evelyn opened the door. Alex stepped in. No sudden movements, no eagerness. He stopped at a respectful distance from the bed and sat. His gaze met hers, quietly, as if asking permission to be present. Mia looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "I don't know why he came back. But I think he doesn't want to belong to bad people anymore." Evelyn smiled. "Some creatures don't need words to say sorry. They just need to act enough to be forgiven." Alex slowly leaned forward, then walked to the side of the bed. Mia reached out her hand. He gently placed his head in her palm, a silent, whole moment. That night, in a hospital room lit with soft yellow light, Mia slept her first dreamless sleep in months. Alex lay at the foot of her bed, eyes half closed, occasionally shifting in place. Outside the window, the sky was dusted with stars, and St. Elora, once a place of last chances, was now gently stitching something human back together. Later that afternoon, just as golden light kissed the tops of the trees outside St. Elora's front porch, a woman stepped into ICU room 4, thin frame, disheveled hair from the road, and red, tear-swollen eyes. It was Julia Ellison, Mia's mother. Lieutenant Tanner had contacted her after Mia's identity was confirmed through the missing children's database and matched with her newborn fingerprint records. Julia nearly collapsed when she heard the voice on the phone. "We found your daughter. She's alive." Mia lay still on the hospital bed, her face calm beneath the soft ceiling light. Julia stepped forward, hands trembling as she took her daughter's hand, afraid that if she held on too tightly, the moment might dissolve into a dream. "My sweet girl," her voice broke. "I'm here now. I'm so sorry I couldn't find you sooner." Evelyn stood quietly in the corner, giving them the privacy they needed. But when Julia's eyes unintentionally landed on the dog curled up beside the bed, her breath hitched. "That dog," she whispered. "It can't be." Alex didn't move, but his ears twitched slightly, as if recognizing a voice long buried in the past. Later that evening, during a private meeting between Julia, Tanner, and Cale, Julia finally shared what she had hidden for years, not just from the police, but from herself. "The man who fathered Mia, his name is Jonah Creed. We met when I was just 20, young, naive. At first he was charming, intelligent, but little by little he revealed another face, obsessed with control, perfection. When I became pregnant, I wanted to leave. But Jonah wouldn't allow it." "How did you get away?" Tanner asked. "At first I thought I couldn't, but then I staged a fake accident, fled with help from a friend. I changed my name, moved to another state, gave birth to Mia in secret. I never dared use her real name on any records. I thought I had erased every trace, until Mia disappeared 3 months ago." Julia lowered her head, tears dripping onto the back of her hand. "I didn't think he'd find her, but I was wrong." When Evelyn mentioned Alex, the dog who had brought Mia to the hospital, Julia went pale. Jonah had a German shepherd. He trained it like a weapon, not to protect, but to intimidate. That night, when Julia returned to sit beside Mia, she asked softly, "Do you remember anything about your father?" Mia blinked, then shook her head. "I didn't know he was my dad. I only knew his name was Jonah." The moment that name left her lips, Alex shot upright. His ears snapped forward, eyes wide. He barked, loud, sharp, echoing down the hallway. His claws scratched against the floor, agitated, as if something long buried had suddenly broken free. "Mama, don't say that name," Mia whispered, curling her arms around her knees. "I hate that name. Every time I hear it, I remember the rope." Julia held her tightly, eyes brimming. "What did he do to you?" Mia burrowed deeper into her mother's arms. After a moment, she spoke, slow, halting. "One time, he told Alex to attack me, but Alex didn't, so he got mad. He hit Alex with a metal whip. Every time Alex turned his head away, he hit him again." Julia began to tremble. Her hand clenched, eyes blazing red, but Mia's voice grew strangely calm. "After that, Alex stopped looking at him. He only looked at me. Then he lay down. Didn't move. And the next time, when he threw snakes into my room, Alex broke the door. He pushed me out. And then I don't remember anything. I just remember the light and the wind in the sand." Evelyn stepped in just then, carrying a warm cup of tea for Julia. Alex had returned to his usual place, curled in the corner of the room, head resting on his front paws, but eyes still trained on Mia. "What do you think of that dog now?" Evelyn asked. Mia looked at Alex, quiet for a long moment, then said softly, "He used to be Jonah's dog, but not anymore. Now, he's Alex, and he chose to be good." Julia smiled through her tears. Evelyn reached down and stroked Alex's back, whispering, "He isn't a product of training. He's a product of his own choice." And in the softly lit room, 3 souls, a mother burdened by guilt, a child recently freed from nightmare, and a dog who once lived in darkness, sat together in silence. No words were needed, because some forgiveness isn't spoken. It's offered in presence. Steady, gentle, like the way Alex lay there, guarding Mia's sleep. Nights at St. Elora were usually quiet, especially in the ICU, where doors stayed half-closed, the lights dimmed low, and every movement slowed to the rhythm of time itself. But tonight, something felt different. The ceiling light flickered once, faintly. A breeze slipped through the end of the corridor, lifting the sheer curtain just enough to let it wave once, then fall gently back into place, like a silent bow before something unknown. The time was 1:17 a.m. On the 3rd floor, in the service wing, a man entered through the emergency exit. Pale blue uniform, maintenance badge clipped to his chest. Ken R., a toolbox in his right hand, his footsteps steady, unhurried. He walked like someone who knew the building well. The elevator doors opened. The man didn't step in immediately. He scanned the hallway, his eyes not looking for things to fix, but mapping a route. He pressed the button for the 4th floor, where Mia was sleeping. Downstairs, Alex stirred from his place at Mia's bedside. The room light blinked once more. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply lifted his head and leaned toward the door, alert, still, his ears raised, eyes sharp and gleaming. Julia sat slouched in the chair, nodding off as sleep briefly claimed her. Mia remained in deep slumber. But Alex had already stepped into the hallway. Every step he took was light, almost silent, like a shadow moving through the forest, not wanting to make a sound, but ready to stop at any moment and confront what waited ahead. At the bend near the elevator, Alex froze. The man in a maintenance uniform had just stepped out of the lift. He paused for half a second upon seeing Alex, his eyes flickering for a brief moment, then turned and headed towards the electrical room. But to Alex, that scent was unmistakable. He growled low, sharp and broken, a sound more warning than threat, like a whisper laced with fire. Evelyn, just down the hall checking the oxygen monitor in the next room, caught a glimpse of Alex's gray-black form streaking through the corridor like an arrow loosed. She immediately took off after him. "Alex, what is it?" The dog didn't stop. He was giving chase. The man in the maintenance uniform had just opened the door to the electrical room when Alex lunged, barking with force that shook the walls. "Woof, woof!" His barks shattered the nighttime silence like thunder. Motion sensor lights flicked on down the corridor in sequence. Nurses rushed out from the duty room. Evelyn shouted, "Intruder on the floor!" Inside the room, the man tried to keep calm. I was dispatched to check the circuit breakers." Tanner, on duty that night on the second floor, received the emergency alert. He immediately drew his weapon and bolted up the emergency stairwell to the fourth floor. Alex had stopped barking now. He backed up a few steps, planting himself firmly in front of the exit, growling, guarding, like a living wall between a threat and the world beyond it. And Evelyn realized something in that moment. Alex wasn't just reacting. He was recognizing. "That's him," she breathed. "That's Jonah." Tanner arrived, weapon lowered but steady. "Take your hands out of your pockets. Raise them. Now!" The man turned. His eyes were sharp, like blades. Gone was the nervous posture of a maintenance worker. He smiled faintly, a smile that never touched his eyes. "We meet again, officer." Tanner froze. Jonah Creed. Jonah removed his hard hat, revealing cropped hair and a sharp-boned, hollow face, one that had once sat on a wanted poster for years. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said evenly. "I just want to see my daughter. Just once." "You have no right to make that demand," Tanner snapped. Jonah narrowed his eyes. "Then if I have no right, I'll take my last option." From his pocket, he pulled out a small glass syringe filled with a clear liquid. "If you don't let me see her, I inject this. It's 10 times more lethal than snake venom." Tanner stiffened, eyes flicking toward Alex, who had inched forward, gaze locked on the syringe. He was waiting. One signal. But before anything else could happen, Mia appeared. She stood at the far end of the hallway, hair tousled, bandages still on her hands, but her eyes calm, in a way no one expected. "You're not my father." Jonah stopped cold. "My dad wouldn't lock me in a room with snakes. My dad wouldn't beat a dog for not hurting me. My dad isn't you." Alex barked once, sharp, clear, then charged. Not at Jonah himself, but at the hand holding the syringe. The attack was surgical. Alex sank his teeth into Jonah's wrist, sending the glass syringe flying into the air. It shattered on the floor, spilling the poison. Jonah screamed, collapsing just as Tanner moved in, grabbing him and locking his arms behind his back. Once everything was under control, as officers escorted Jonah down the hallway in restraints, Mia approached Alex, knelt beside him, and wrapped her arms around his neck. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered into his ear. "Because you came back. And this time, you came to protect." Evelyn lowered herself beside them, watching as the girl and the dog embraced beneath the flickering lights of the corridor. "We're not in the dark anymore, Alex. We found each other, and we chose the right side." That night, St. Elora Hospital stayed lit until dawn. But in a small room on the 4th floor, where a little girl and her dog lay curled together on a soft rug, everything had returned to peace. Jonah was placed in temporary isolation under maximum security within St. Elora before being transferred to the state holding facility. The wound from Alex's bite had been dressed, but his eyes, though carefully blank, couldn't hide the rage simmering underneath. Evelyn, Kyle, Tanner, and Julia were placed under heightened security. Jonah, once the mastermind of an illegal underground compound, wasn't likely to accept defeat quietly, especially not when he knew Mia was still inside the hospital. That afternoon, the hospital corridor felt as quiet as any other day. But beneath that stillness, something hovered, something ready to shatter. "Sheriff," a nurse whispered over the intercom. "Jonah has requested to see Mia. He says he wants to apologize, and he has information." Tanner looked to Evelyn, then to Julia. "Number, that's not happening." But Jonah didn't wait for permission. At 5:26 p.m., the auxiliary wing's alarm flashed red. Security discovered his room empty. The door was intact, but surveillance footage captured a scene that sent chills through everyone watching. Jonah had retrieved a hidden syringe from the heel of his shoe and used a looped copper wire around his wrist to override the electronic lock. He was heading toward the ICU. He was heading for Mia. Alex sensed it first. He shot up, nose to the air, catching a scent thick with sweat, metal, and something else. Something that smelled like betrayal. Evelyn had stepped out of Mia's room for just a few minutes, leaving a nurse on duty. Julia sat in the corner, peeling fruit. Mia was happily drawing with the new set of colored pencils she'd just received. Jonah's silhouette appeared on the glass wall of the corridor. He walked briskly, both hands buried in the pockets of his hospital coat. Alex growled softly. In a split second, he darted through the door, slamming it open with enough force to make Julia look up and Mia drop her pencil. Jonah stood in the doorway. "Little one," he said, his voice no longer trembling. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you the way a father should." Julia moved in front of Mia instantly. "You're not allowed near her." Jonah raised his hand, and in that instant, the syringe glinted in his grip. "Step back, all of you," he shouted. "I'm not here to hurt her. I came to end this." Evelyn and Tanner reached the hallway just in time to see the scene unfold. Both froze. If Jonah plunged the syringe into himself, he could die before revealing the full truth, and the law would never uncover the network behind the compound. "Jonah!" Tanner yelled. "Stop, you don't have to do this." Jonah chuckled. "You think I'm a monster? Then I'll die like a snake, silent and full of venom." He raised the syringe, aiming it straight at his neck, but Alex launched. From the corner of the room, the gray dog moved like a forest thunderbolt, leaping across the hospital bed, past Julia, across the thin line between life and death, straight for the arm holding the syringe. The impact knocked Jonah backwards. The syringe hit the floor and rolled under the bed. Alex stood between Jonah and Mia, body tense, raised high, letting out a deep growl that echoed through the room. But he didn't bite again. He didn't need to. He was standing guard. Tanner moved in swiftly and restrained Jonah, locking his wrists in cuffs. Evelyn retrieved the syringe, her face draining of color. "This is the same compound we found at the camp. If it had been injected, it would have killed in under 90 seconds, Mia whispered, clutching Julia's shirt. "He saved me again." After Jonah was escorted away under tight security, Julia wrapped her arms around her daughter. Evelyn sat beside Alex, running her hand along his back, over the faded scar that still traced the ridge of his spine. "He's no longer a weapon," she whispered. "He's instinct that chose compassion." Alex sat down and gently rested his head in Mia's lap. She was still trembling. But in that embrace, her eyes began to glow again, not just with gratitude, but with newfound trust. "He doesn't have to belong to anyone," Mia said softly. "He's Alex, and he's family." That evening, the hospital returned to peace. Outside, the sunset laid a warm orange blanket over the lawn. Julia read her book. Mia added more color to her sketch. And Alex, curled up at the foot of the bed, breathed steadily, as if the chaos of the world had finally left them alone. But everyone knew. A brutal chapter had just closed. And the greatest miracle wasn't that Alex stopped an attack. It was that he redefined survival through a leap of trust. No one noticed when Alex began to slow down. After Jonah was subdued and taken from the hospital, while people hurried to talk about Mia's survival, the shattered syringe, and what tomorrow's court session or investigation might bring, Alex, the quiet hero of it all, quietly retreated to the hallway. He didn't bark. He didn't lie down. He simply walked toward the corridor window. His silhouette blended into the amber light of dusk. And then, Without a sound, Alex collapsed. Alex? Evelyn was the first to see him fall. She ran, dropped to her knees, pressed her hand to his neck. His pulse was faint, breathing, barely a thread. "Someone call Dr. Kale, now!" Mia broke from Julia's arms and ran over. When she saw Alex lying on his side, eyes half closed, body unmoving, she froze in place. No. He's okay, right?" Her voice trembled. Kale arrived within minutes. He knelt beside Alex, examined him quickly, and let out a long, heavy breath. "He's going into shock. Could be internal trauma, or a reaction from the impact." "What does that mean?" Evelyn asked, visibly shaken. "It's possible when he struck Jonah, an old injury reopened or—" Kyle hesitated. A shard of the broken syringe pierced soft tissue. "Can you fix it?" Mia asked, her eyes red and wide. Kyle looked at her, then slowly shook his head. "We'll try everything we can. But Alex is a fighter, and fighters sometimes need a miracle." Alex was rushed to the special veterinary treatment unit in the hospital's adjacent wing, just a few buildings away. The head vet, Dr. Ingrid Morris, quickly ordered an X-ray and emergency fluids. The results left everyone breathless. A thin, nearly invisible metal fragment had lodged itself deep inside Alex's chest cavity, causing microtrauma to his left lung. If not treated soon, Alex wouldn't survive the night. In the room full of machines, Mia stood beside the treatment table, her small hand holding Alex's front paw, right where the blood had dried to a dark, rust-colored crust. "I don't know how to pray," she whispered, "but if anyone is listening, I just want to ask for him to stay." Evelyn stood behind her, eyes damp. Julia gently wrapped her arms around her daughter and sat down beside Alex as well. Mia leaned her forehead against the dog's. The silence was so deep, it seemed to swallow the sound of the machines. And then, she spoke a sentence that no one in that room would ever forget. "You can't leave me. You chose to save me. So you're not allowed to leave me alone." It wasn't a command. It was a thread, fragile yet unbreakable, binding the small life of a child to the spirit of a creature that had carried the weight of countless wounds. The night passed. Outside, a light rain began to fall, each drop tapping against the window pane in a steady rhythm, like a lullaby for warriors. Alex remained motionless. Dr. Ingrid came in from time to check the monitors, but no one could say for certain if he would make it. The silence no longer felt frightening. It was reverence for a fighter waging his battle in his own way. Silent, resilient, and whole. Dawn. Around 5 a.m., Mia had fallen asleep beside him, her head resting on the edge of the table, her hand never let go. And then there was movement, not a beep from the monitor, not the sound of a footstep, but a breath, longer, deeper. Ingrid sat up straight and glanced at the screen. "Heartbeat just stabilized," Evelyn gasped. "He's coming back." Alex stirred. A faint whimper slipped from his throat, soft like the crack of ice after a long winter. Then his eyes slowly opened, those familiar amber eyes, dimmed but still glowing with that unmistakable spark. Mia awoke with a jolt. "Alex!" He lifted his head, very slowly, as if every motion needed to be measured with care. Mia burst into tears. But they weren't tears of fear. They were the kind that came when something precious, thought lost forever, found its way back. Later that afternoon, St. Elora Hospital received a special visitor. The commander of the state K9 unit arrived to meet Alex. They brought a small medal, engraved with the words, "Alex, a living trust, the one who chose compassion in the darkness, a hero without title who lived as one." But the medal wasn't placed around Alex's neck. Instead, they hung it on the wall in Mia's room, right where Alex could see it each day from where he lay, not as an award, but as a reminder. A hero is never alone. Spring wind drifted through the slightly open window of the third-floor recovery ward at St. Elora, carrying the scent of damp earth and the soft chirping of early-season birds. Gentle sunlight spilled across the sill, touching the edge of the blank paper where Mia sat drawing, with her left hand, since her right arm was still lightly bandaged. Alex lay quietly at the foot of the bed, his breathing steady, eyes half closed, but his ears twitched constantly, as if the German shepherd was still standing guard over the girl's every thought. Since the day they nearly lost Alex, something in Mia had shifted. It was as if she had grown up overnight. No longer the shy child hiding behind her mother, she now stepped forward to share fragments of memory she once tried desperately to forget. "I don't remember everything," Mia began during her session with the investigation team and child psychologist. Her voice was soft but steady. "But I remember the smells." "What kind of smells?" the lead therapist asked gently, careful not to press too hard. "Snakes." The room went completely still. Mia set her colored pencil down. Her fingers reached for the little star necklace resting against her collarbone, the one found in the cave where Alex had led the search team. "There was a cold room," she continued, her gaze fixed on the page she was sketching. "So cold, even though it was in the middle of the desert. Glass cases hung on the walls. Inside were snakes, all kinds." Evelyn, seated beside her, nodded slowly. "How do you remember them?" "Some were as long as an adult's arm. Some were black and shiny like coal. Some had red eyes, and one had no eyes at all, but still knew I was watching it." Mia looked up. Her eyes were clear, but lit with a strange, quiet clarity. "Him, Jonah, he used to stand in the center of the room wearing a white coat. Whenever I cried, he'd say, 'Fear sharpens their senses.' Then he'd laugh." Julia, Mia's mother, held her daughter's hand tighter, but Mia didn't pull away. She was still speaking. "He didn't call us by name. He used numbers. Number 3, blood draw. Number 5, neural response. I was number 7. "Did you see the other children?" a social worker asked. Mia nodded. "There was a boy named Kai. He liked to hum songs to himself. A curly-haired girl named Nora. She always held a teddy bear. One time she shouted, 'We're not objects.' And the next day, she was gone." In the adjacent observation room, Tanner, the lead investigator, listened in silence. His jaw tightened. "What did he call the children?" he asked through the microphone. Mia answered at almost the exact same moment from the other room. "Jonah said we were his perfect collection. He said, 'A living collection. Each child is a reaction mechanism, a breathing experiment period.' No one said a word after that. They didn't have to. The truth was being painted stroke by stroke, terrifying, but crystal clear." The next day, Mia asked to speak to Evelyn and Alex alone. She wrapped her arms around the German shepherd and whispered, "There's something I want to say, but only if Alex is here." Evelyn nodded gently. Mia looked directly into Alex's eyes. "One night, I was locked in a room with a cobra. It slithered around my bed. I thought I was going to die. But then, the door burst open. It was you." Alex raised his head slightly, his ears flicking in a way that suggested the memory had returned to him too. "You didn't bark. You just walked in and lay between me and the snake. Even though you were trembling, you didn't move. And the snake left." Evelyn's voice trembled. "So he protected you, even before you knew it." Mia nodded. "I think he was once part of that collection, too. But he chose me instead of following orders." She stroked down the length of Alex's back and whispered, "And from that moment, I believed you were good." In the official court documents, Mia's testimony, though given by a child, was considered pivotal, not only for its detail, but because it was corroborated by physical evidence, video footage, and most remarkably, by Alex's own reactions. The state prosecutor later told the press, "We have a remarkable witness, one who cannot speak, but whose actions are precise, unwavering, and have never betrayed the trust placed in him." St. Elora Hospital organized a small gathering in Maya's honor. She was presented with a new canvas, and the first image she painted on it was a dark room, a snake slithering, and a dog standing between it and a trembling child. Not aggressive, not growling, just eyes bright like fire, those of someone who had chosen to become a shield. That evening, as Alex lay curled at the foot of her bed, Mia sat on the blanket above him, resting her hand on his back and whispering, "Tomorrow I'll tell them everything. For the kids who didn't make it back. And for you, the one who taught me that bravery doesn't need to be loud." Outside, the hallway lights glowed softly, but inside the room, the warmest light came from a child and a dog, two beings once known only by numbers, now finally being called by their names. On a May morning, the state court opened a closed-door hearing regarding the Desert Serpent facility, a case that had shocked the nation when the main perpetrator was revealed to be Jonah Creed, a man who had evaded capture for nearly a decade. Mia wasn't the only witness, but she was the most compelling one, not because of her age or testimony, but because of who sat beside her. Alex. On the witness stand, Mia sat with her mother and attorney, and Alex, no muzzle, no leash, lay calmly at her feet. He wore a soft harness with a single tag that read, "Honorary Witness." Before the court session began, Tanner handed the investigation team a confidential file. Inside it was a military-grade training dossier for an assault dog, codename, a 014, Cerberus. The photos left no doubt. It was Alex. But what stunned everyone was the annotation. Notable traits. Near total obedience, but occasionally shows hesitation when commanded to attack children. Prone to emotional disruption when the target is a vulnerable individual. Additional note, not recommended for psychological control missions involving minors. Kyle read that excerpt aloud during the hearing. Mia gripped her mother's hand tightly, and Alex, silent, eyes closed, remained still. The prosecutor leaned forward. "So, Alex was trained to attack, but he refused to carry out the mission, and was dismissed from the program?" Tanner nodded. Not only that, after being returned to the facility, Alex was reassigned from active operations to presence control, meaning he was positioned near children as an intimidation tool. And in that situation, he resisted. "Number not resisted," Tanner replied. "He pretended to obey." A handwritten log by a technician arrested during the raid revealed, "A 014 stopped barking when given commands, but still followed every basic directive. We thought it had been mentally broken until kids started vanishing from the system." They slipped out during shift changes, always the shifts where A014 was posted. At first we thought it was coincidence, but by the third time, we suspected. One child scribbled on the stone wall, "Alex watches over us. He doesn't bite." Evelyn, called to testify, stood before the court and said, "No one taught Alex the difference between right and wrong. No one told him to lie between a trembling child and a cobra. No one ordered him to drag Mia out of the desert across more than 10 kilometers of searing heat to find a hospital. And no one instructed him to remain silent, to endure, just to protect lives no one had counted. What some might call betrayal of training protocol?" Evelyn paused, then glanced down at Alex. "To us, it was the purest form of loyalty." Mia was later granted permission to address the court. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. She simply sat up straight and spoke every word with clarity. I don't know why a dog trained to do bad things would choose to do good, but I do know, if Alex had obeyed Jonah that day, I wouldn't be alive to sit here now. She turned toward the silent German shepherd at her feet. And I don't think he betrayed anyone. I think he saved himself from becoming a dog with no soul. No one clapped, but the room held its breath. Following the hearing, the court issued formal charges against Jonah Creed, not only for child abuse and abduction, but for the unlawful use of conditioned animals as psychological weapons against minors, a rarely used statute that, in this case, set a historic precedent. In the headlines, they called it, "The trial where the strongest witness told the whole story with nothing but his eyes." That evening, as everything came to a close, Evelyn took Mia and Alex to the small park behind the hospital. The sun was setting. The grass was soft. A breeze moved gently through the air. And Alex, no longer bracing himself for the next command, lay peacefully beside Mia, breathing with the calm of someone finally allowed to rest. "What do you think of Cerberus?" Evelyn asked, running her hand over his ear. Mia shook her head. "That name doesn't fit." "What name would you choose?" Mia wrapped her arms around Alex. "I already did. Alex means protector. He's a friend, a dog who betrayed cruelty. To stay loyal to the children, no one counted." Alex didn't respond. But the way he looked at Mia, that gaze, was one the whole world could understand. A creature once forced into obedience had chosen love instead, and called it freedom. The morning after the hearing, the sky over St. Elora felt unusually gentle. Pale sunlight filtered through the trees lining the hospital courtyard, creating scattered patches of light, like the place itself was learning to breathe again, one peaceful rhythm at a time. Alex lay beside Mia, legs stretched out, breathing evenly, but eyes wide open, alert, listening. Julia was preparing tea when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen from a different state. "Hello, this is Julia Ellison," she answered, her voice still soft from the emotional exhaustion of the previous day. There was silence for a few seconds on the other end. Then a woman's voice came, fragile and trembling. "You're Mia's mother?" Julia tightened her grip on the phone. "Yes. Who is this?" "I'm Claire. I was Jonah Creed's first wife." Claire agreed to a video call, and within minutes, her face appeared on the hospital's conference room screen. A woman in midlife, her hair streaked with gray, and eyes heavy with the kind of weariness that only comes from a past too restless to sleep. I probably shouldn't be calling. But when I saw Mia on the news, and saw that dog, Alex, I knew it was time to speak the truth I've never dared to tell. Evelyn, Tanner, and Cale sat together inside the room. Mia remained just outside, held gently by Julia, only brought in when absolutely necessary. Claire swallowed hard. "I met Jonah when we were both studying pharmacology. At first he was incredibly intelligent. No one questioned him. And when our first son was born, everything still seemed fine." "His name was Daniel," Claire continued, her eyes glistening. "He was born with a congenital heart defect. The doctor said he wouldn't live more than a few years." Her voice cracked. "But Jonah refused to accept that. He became obsessed with curing him, with saving our son by any means necessary. And then he started studying biotoxins. He said, if death begins inside the body, we need to teach it how to survive with venom." Tanner leaned forward, frowning. "You mean he used snakes?" Claire nodded slowly. "At first it was just serums, modeled simulations, but then he brought home live snakes and began injecting small doses into Daniel when the boy was only 4. Kyle could barely process it. Did the child survive? Claire was silent for a long moment. Number Daniel died at 6. Not from his heart condition, but from systemic poisoning, after Jonah increased the dose to test his limit. No one in the room could speak. The police couldn't prove anything. I had no evidence, and I, just a broken mother, could only run. Claire took a breath, then gave them the final truth. He whispered to me the night I left, "If the world won't give me a perfect family, I'll build one. The next child won't be like Daniel. It will be stronger. It will endure. It will turn fear into immunity. And the dogs, they'll be the wall that shields it." Evelyn glanced at Tanner. Their eyes met briefly before both settled on Alex, the German shepherd still lying quietly nearby, yet seemingly absorbing every word. The call ended in silence. Claire left them with one last message. "Please tell Mia, none of this is her fault. And if you can, don't let Alex be seen only as a victim. That dog lived like someone who knew exactly what was right." That afternoon, Evelyn sat down with Mia and told her everything, slowly, carefully. She didn't share every detail, only that Jonah had once had a child, and when he couldn't save that child, he tried to recreate a family, twisted by grief and obsession. Mia listened without interrupting. She sat in silence for a long time. Then finally she said softly, "So, he wasn't born cruel. He just never learned how to love the right way." Julia pulled her daughter close. Mia leaned forward, gently stroking Alex's head, whispering, "And you were taught wrong too, but you made a different choice. So I will too. I'll live right, for those who never got the chance." That night, Mia stayed up later than usual. She wrote a letter and taped it to the door of the recovery ward. "If anyone was ever kept somewhere like I was, if anyone was ever forced to be called a number, if anyone ever thought no one would come to save them, please believe me, I was saved by a dog who used to belong to the bad ones. But then, he chose to be someone who stood in the light." And at the bottom, a tiny, wobbly signature, barely legible but unmistakably sincere. Mia and Alex. St. Elora glowed beneath the early summer sun. The trees rustled with a new rhythm, sweeping away the stale air of the months before and replacing it with something brighter, lighter, full of hope. But inside one sealed room, the words that had just been spoken made that light feel distant. Jonah had decided to speak. In the detention center, under the watch of a lawyer and judicial officer, he sat across from Julia behind a thick glass barrier, his voice transmitted through a small speaker on the table between them. He didn't lift his head at first. But when he did speak, his voice wasn't cold. It was hoarse, like ashes clinging to his throat. "The girl, Mia, she's my biological daughter. I didn't want to say it in court. But if you still have a shred of dignity left, Julia, tell her the truth." Julia said nothing. Her hands were tightly clasped in her lap, her eyes locked on the face of the man she had spent over a decade running from. "I knew you were pregnant when you left," Jonah went on, his tone steady. "And I knew she was mine, the moment I saw her eyes. They're exactly like Daniel's." Out in the hallway, Evelyn and Kyle sat side by side, watching every motion through the one-way glass. Tanner stood with arms crossed, leaning against the wall, eyes never leaving Jonah's slightest movement. "He's not trying to escape guilt," Evelyn whispered. "No," Kale replied, voice low. "He's trying to rewrite the ending, his way." Back in the room, Julia finally spoke. "You had the chance to be a father, with Daniel. And what did you do? You used snakes to cure him. You played doctor, played judge, redefined love like it was some kind of experiment." Jonah's hands clenched. For the first time he raised his eyes, wet, not angry. "I didn't kill Daniel because I was cruel. I just couldn't bear to feel powerless. Julia shook her head. No one asked you to be omnipotent, but you chose to play God, and the price was a child. You should have stopped. And you disappeared, Jonah laughed bitterly. No letter, no trace. When I saw Mia on the news, I thought I was dreaming, a part of the past, alive again, still perfect. She's not perfect, Julia said firmly. She's been scared, she's been hurt, she's fallen. But she got up. And that's what you never understood. Love isn't control. It's letting a soul grow in its own way. That evening, when Julia returned to the hospital garden, Mia was sitting with Alex beneath a tree. The wind tousled her hair, and Alex's tail swayed gently in the breeze. I have something to tell you, Julia said, sitting down beside them, her eyes soft. Mia looked up. What is it, Mom? It's about Jonah, about the truth I've kept from you. The little girl blinked, her small hands resting quietly on Alex's back. Julia spoke slowly. She told Mia that once, long ago, she had loved Jonah and trusted him. That when she became pregnant, she began noticing signs, his obsession with control, his dream of building a flawless family immune to error, and the chilling whispers he muttered in the dead of night. I was afraid. If you were born in that house, you wouldn't be a child. You'd be a formula to perfect. Mia didn't speak. Her eyes lowered to Alex. I changed my name, cut all ties, left everything behind. All I wanted was for you to grow up like a child should, not as someone's experiment. So, I'm really his daughter? Mia asked, voice trembling but calm. Julia nodded. By blood, yes. But who stayed up all night when you had a fever? Who held your hand on your first day of school? Who sang you lullabies when the nightmares came? Mia leaned into her mother's shoulder. And if your name isn't Creed, but Ellison, then that means you don't belong to the shadow of the past. You belong to the light you chose. That night, as the sky dimmed, Mia sat writing in her journal. Alex rested quietly beside her, his breathing deep and steady. I'm not afraid of the truth, because I lived to understand it. Because Alex made sure I wouldn't become part of Jonah's broken dream. And because my mom, who chose to run, not out of weakness, but with the courage to begin again. I know half of my blood comes from someone who lost his way, but I'll live to heal the other half. She finished the entry with a drawing. A toppled tree, its roots exposed. And from the cracked roots, a tender green sprout reached upward toward the sky. Beneath it, she wrote, Not every dream has to be perfect. Some just need to be planted again, with love. On a summer morning, beneath a clear sky and the gentle shade of old oak trees, the state Supreme Court convened for its final hearing. There was something solemn, almost sacred in the air, as if, after so much chaos, the world had finally found the rightful place for what was right, and what was wrong. Inside the courtroom, Jonah Creed stood in a pale gray prison uniform, collar undone, hands folded in front of him. He looked at no one. He offered no excuses. The arrogance that once marked his every word had vanished. He stood like a man who knew the sentence long before it was read, and waited for it like the last line of a story he could no longer rewrite. The prosecutor read the charges one final time. The words were clear, unembellished. Each count spoken slowly, like layers of ash settling over the name of a man who once believed he could control the fate of others. Child abduction. Use of conditioned animals as instruments of threat. Intentional neurological harm to a minor. Indirectly causing the death of Daniel Creed, his own son. Fraudulent identity to infiltrate a high-security medical facility. The evidence was undeniable. The witnesses, from the rescued children to hospital staff, and even a silent dog who had lived like a testament no one could ignore, had already spoken for all that remained. When the judge rose to announce the verdict, The courtroom held its breath. No shuffling of papers, no coughs, no glances at the clock. Jonah Creed, the council hereby sentences you to life imprisonment without parole. You are to be held in permanent solitary confinement at Granite Valley Special Security Facility. All visitation rights are permanently revoked concerning the witness Maya Ellison for her protection and safety as a high-priority minor. Jonah closed his eyes. Slowly, without protest. As the guards led him down the hallway, golden sunlight slanting in from the long windows, he turned once, just once, toward the back row of the courtroom. There was no one sitting there, but he gave a slight nod. Perhaps to his own past. At that very moment, in the quiet garden behind St. Elora Hospital, Mia sat beside Alex, holding a starfish-shaped cookie, the kind she loved as a child. Today marked the official end of her psychological treatment. Dr. Kale had just handed her a small certificate, sketched with a rising sun. "Do you want to ask your mom about the other day?" Evelyn asked gently, sitting beside her. Mia shook her head. "I don't need to." "Because you don't want to know." "No, because I already know enough," Mia said with a soft smile. "I know who brought me into the world, but more importantly, I know who stayed, who chose to love me even when I wasn't perfect." Alex looked up. His ears relaxed. His nose nudged into Mia's hand, a small gesture, but firm and certain. "Sometimes," Mia continued, "people don't need an apology, just a warm hug, or a well-timed leap, or someone's eyes watching over them, step by step." Julia never told Mia the full truth about her blood relation to Jonah. She chose not to hide the truth, but to protect the healing. In a handwritten letter tucked away in a drawer, saved for the day Mia would be ready to ask, Julia wrote, "Blood doesn't define who we are. Our choices do. You owe the past nothing. You only need to live in the present, where you're called by your real name, and where you have a friend who will always choose to stand between you and fear." The day Jonah left St. Elora for Granite Valley, no one came to see him off. No one chased after the armored vehicle. Only a German shepherd stood still in the hospital courtyard, watching as the van turned onto the main road. His gaze held no hatred, no fear, not even sorrow. Only closure. Mia sat beside him, her arms wrapped around the honor witness medal she had asked to keep on Alex's behalf. "We don't need to know whether he regrets anything," Mia whispered, "because we've already moved on." Alex wagged his tail, then turned with quiet purpose, walking alongside Mia toward the narrow stone path behind the main building. The sunlight still poured over the courtyard. Leaves still drifted down with the breeze. And there, side by side, one girl, one dog, walked on together, as if not a single step had ever separated them. On a rare, clear day in the middle of summer, the state court convened for its final hearing. Across headlines, a single line echoed, "Jonah Creed, the man who sowed fear, now faces justice." Inside the courtroom, the stark white light from the ceiling no longer felt cold. No one feared Jonah anymore. No one bowed under the glare that once sent lives curling into silence behind iron bars and darkness. He sat still, hands cuffed loosely before the stand. His face was more hollow, eyes sunken, salt and pepper hair slightly disheveled. But the fire in his eyes was gone. There was no defiance, only a quiet, hollow look of someone who knew he had lost. Not to the law, but to the choice he should have made a long time ago. Mia wasn't present. Following the legal team's advice, she listened to the verdict through a filtered live stream in a private room at St. Elora, where sound was softened and every second carefully shielded. Julia, however, sat in the courtroom. Her eyes steady, one hand gripping Mia's necklace, clutching the breath of her daughter as if keeping her close in spirit. Alex, for special reasons, wasn't there either. He lay outside in the hospital courtyard as always, ears twitching every time a door creaked open. When the prosecutor read the charges, the room fell completely silent. Jonah Creed is charged with 17 counts, including child abduction, psychological abuse, use of trained animals as threats, concealing a death, and unauthorized deployment of banned biological substances. In addition, the defendant is prosecuted for orchestrating an unethical emotional experiment on underage children. Every charge was backed by Mia's testimony, rescue team evidence, documents from Claire, Jonah's ex-wife, and most remarkably the non-verbal testimony of Alex, a dog once trained to obey, who chose instead to protect life. It took the judge no more than 30 minutes to reach the final sentence. Defendant Jonah Creed, sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Strictly prohibited from contacting, writing to, or requesting visitation with any child survivor, specifically Mia Ellison. Jonah did not bow his head, but for the first time, he closed his eyes. No one knew what he was thinking, whether it was relief or simply the quiet reckoning of conscience catching up at last. That evening, as the news echoed on every channel, Mia sat quietly in the back garden of the hospital. In her hands was the printed verdict. Beside her, Alex lay peacefully, one paw crossed over the other. Mia didn't ask many questions. She only said, "So, it's over now, isn't it?" Alex didn't respond, but the silence he offered had the shape of reassurance. Julia sat beside her daughter, gently placing her hand on Mia's shoulder. "You'll never have to see him again. You won't have to hear another word from him. You don't need to forgive if you're not ready." Mia nodded, her eyes lifting to the sky. "And was he my real father?" she asked, softly. Julia paused. In that instant, she understood. Truth, if allowed to continue living, must be filtered like sunlight through stained glass. Only what the heart can hold without burning should be let through. She smiled gently. "Your father is the one who chose to love you, who accepted you, protected you, and always stood on the side of light. That person is still right here." Mia turned to Alex. "Then I guess I have two fathers, one by blood who couldn't hold on to me, and one who never needed words, but I trusted anyway." She leaned down and wrapped her arms around Alex's neck. "Thank you for not following orders. Thank you for betraying the wrong to choose what's right." A week later, Mia was discharged. That morning, St. Elora held a small farewell gathering. No flowers, no cameras, just the people who had walked this path with her. Evelyn held Mia tightly. Cale rested a hand on Alex's head in silent blessing, and Julia walked hand in hand with her daughter through the same gate they once entered in fear. Now, they stepped out with new hearts. Mia would never know that Jonah was her biological father, and she didn't need to. Julia kept her promise, to bury that truth so her daughter would never have to live between the cracks of nature and consequence. Mia would grow up with memories clear enough to remember courage, but gentle enough not to dim the light that remained. And in the story she would someday write, starting with the words, "There once was a dog trained to attack, but he chose silence. Then he chose to protect. Then he chose to love." She never mentioned Jonah, only Alex, and those who walked through pain, so no one else would have to walk alone again. 1 week after her discharge, Mia and Alex returned to St. Elora, not because of injury, but because of a promise. She wanted to see the first person who welcomed her that day. Head nurse Nancy Wheeler. The morning air was fresh. Sunlight leaned gently across the white steps of the treatment wing. Nancy was already waiting, uniform crisp, but her face far softer than it had once been. She bent down to meet Mia's hug, no longer patient and nurse, but family reunited. Alex followed, walking calmly behind her, as if every hallway was already his. Nancy led the two of them to the back garden, a quiet space where stone benches nestled beneath whispering cypress trees, and red brick tiles peeked gently through the grass, each square bearing the imprint of children who once planted flowers and carved their own little messages into time. Mia remained silent along the way. Only when she sat beside Nancy, her hands clenching the straps of her backpack, did she finally ask a question, one that made Nancy pause mid-pour as she filled their teacups. "Is it my fault Alex ended up like this?" The words didn't sound like a confession, but more like an old scar breaking open, the kind that lies deep inside, invisible until it finally finds its voice. Nancy turned toward her, eyes soft. She didn't answer immediately, but gently asked back, "Why do you think that?" Mia looked down. "Because if I hadn't been in danger, if I hadn't been there, he wouldn't have had to run into the fire. He wouldn't have needed to fight. He wouldn't be hurt. Wouldn't have almost died." Alex, lying at their feet, seemed half asleep. But at the phrase, "almost died," one ear twitched slightly, as if he were listening to every word. Nancy sighed, then reached into her pocket and placed a small mint candy in Mia's palm. "You know, all of us carry scars. Some are visible, like stitches or bandages. Others you can't see, etched inside, pressed into memory. Your scar is the question you asked today, and Alex's scar is a choice." "A choice," Mia echoed. Nancy nodded. "You didn't force him to save you. You didn't make him cross the desert or face Jonah. He chose to. Not because you were weak, but because he saw something worth protecting. Just like your mom once chose to walk away from Jonah. Just like you chose to speak your truth, no matter how painful, to protect other children." "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Nancy continued. "It means doing the right thing, even when you're scared, and Alex is living proof of that." At that moment, Kyle, the emergency doctor who'd once saved Mia, stepped into the garden. In his hand was a small leather pouch. He smiled, nodded at Nancy, and knelt to stroke Alex's back. "Still hanging in there, buddy?" Alex cracked open one eye, exhaled, and gave a single flick of his tail, an answer, quiet but full. "Dr. Kale," Mia said softly, "I once asked if he was ever afraid." "Yes," Kale replied, without hesitation. "Everyone is. But Alex knew, if he didn't move forward, you wouldn't have had another chance." He handed the pouch to Mia. "Inside is the first heart trace we recorded when Alex was rushed into surgery. Look here." He pointed. The rhythm was jagged, broken, but still steady. He didn't give up, Mia. Not because he thought he'd survive, but because he didn't want to leave you alone. Mia clutched the pouch to her chest, eyes blurring, not from guilt this time, but from the quiet relief of knowing she hadn't fallen alone. That evening, Mia slipped a small note between two bricks beneath the tree in the back garden. It read, "We all carry scars." But scars don't mean we were weak. They tell the story of when we were brave, even when no one asked us to be. And when the sky turned lavender, Mia and Alex left St. Elora, hand in paw, one girl whose heart had just been stitched back together with trust, and one dog who was once trained to attack, now using those same feet, to walk beside someone into whatever came next. After all the times he had laid between life and death, after every lunge that held both instinct and sacrifice, Alex was finally going home. Not to a shelter, a hospital, or a training cage, but to a true home. Julia's little house sat quietly beneath a maple tree at the end of the street, with a backyard wide enough for a dog to stroll slowly, and a sunlit window perfect for an afternoon nap. Alex was allowed to lie anywhere he liked, but he chose to curl up beside the bookshelf. And that wasn't a coincidence. "I'm going to read to him every day," Mia said, her hand resting on the spine of an old book titled The Sleepless Night Watchman. Julia chuckled softly. "But sweetheart, Alex can't read." Mia didn't answer. She just leaned down and gently stroked the dog sleeping on his side, breathing evenly. "He doesn't need to read. He just needs to hear good things." Alex's recovery wasn't fast. The surgical scar on his left hind leg, left from the final confrontation with Jonah, had healed, but one major tendon wouldn't regenerate. The vet had been blunt. "Alex will have a limp for the rest of his life." But Alex didn't seem to mind. He still walked with Mia every morning, slow but steady. At the park, when they came across playful puppies, he simply sat and waited, letting them whirl around him before calmly rising. No barking, no showing off. As if Alex had forgiven his own body, forgiven what others might call weakness. But for him, it was proof he was still alive to keep going. Every afternoon, Mia brought out a book to the porch, a different chapter each day. Fairy tales, children's stories, even entries from her own private journal. "Listen, okay?" Mia would say, resting her head on Alex's shoulder. "Once upon a time, there was a night watchman who didn't know how to sleep. But instead of being sad, he started guarding other people's dreams. And every night, he found a fear, and stood right in front of it. Each word Mia read wasn't for spelling practice, nor for pronunciation. It was more like a quiet confession. To herself. And to Alex, the one who listened simply by lying still. One afternoon, when golden sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, Julia walked in and found Mia holding a book, though she wasn't reading anymore. The girl was writing something on the blank inside cover. "What are you writing?" Julia asked. Mia looked up and smiled. "I'm giving it a new ending, one that Alex would like." "Want to read it to me?" Mia nodded. And when the watchman finally learned to sleep, he didn't have to face the fear alone anymore, because next to him was a little girl who read to him every night about beautiful things. And the two of them slept peacefully, not because the world was safe, but because they knew. Together, they could face anything. Julia bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead. "You're not just writing for Alex, sweetheart. You're rewriting yourself." Mia smiled, her eyes shimmering. "I just want him to know, even if he's not as fast as before, even if he can't jump like he used to, he's still Alex to me, the hero who knows how to forgive." That night, with the moon hanging quietly behind the trees, Mia fell asleep on the sofa by the window. The book had slipped onto the carpet. The night lamp glowed in a soft amber hue, and gentle music played from the small speaker in the corner. Alex lay by the foot of the couch, breathing steady, eyes half open, not fully asleep, not quite awake. Perhaps the pain still lingered. Perhaps the wound deep inside hadn't fully quieted. But in that space, surrounded by soft reading, by the warmth of a child who chose to love instead of blame, Alex was no longer the dog of the past. He was part of the home. A memory that forgave. A living reminder that we don't have to be whole to be loved. One Sunday morning, as the kitchen filled with the scent of warm pastries and fresh coffee, Mia carefully tied a red bandana around Alex's neck. The cloth had a faint paw print on it, a gift from her classmates, who called him the dog who listens. Julia stood beside them, smiling. "Who are you dressing up for?" Mia straightened the fold of the scarf, proud. "For him. He's the guest of honor today." "Honor where?" Julia asked curiously. "At St. Elora. Nancy sent an invitation, remember? Nurse Sarah will be there too." Julia nodded gently, a flutter in her chest. Sarah, the nurse who had lost her daughter in the warehouse fire down south, had quietly cared for Mia during her first days, but always kept her distance, as if afraid her heart might crack again. And now, without a single word, Without trying to impress, Alex had slowly dissolved that distance. When the three arrived at the hospital, the back garden had been cleared. A long wooden table stood in the grass, flanked by beige-cushioned benches. Nancy wore a soft floral blouse, her hair neatly tied back, and smiled as Alex approached. "Well, here comes our hero," she said, bending to stroke his head. "Do you know what today is?" Alex looked up, tail swaying gently, as if he truly understood. Sarah stepped out from a side door, carrying 2 small flower pots, one lavender, one rosemary. Her face still held a quiet sadness, but something was different today. Softer, lighter, as if something within her was finally being forgiven. "We thought about creating a little space called Alex's Garden," Nancy said, gesturing for Mia to take a seat. "A place where people can sit quietly, read, or simply breathe." Julia sat beside Sarah. The 2 women, though not close, exchanged a look filled with calm understanding. Nancy continued, "But Sarah and I have another suggestion, a serious one." Mia looked up. "We'd like, if you and your mom agree, to help care for Alex." Julia was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Sarah placed her hand on the table. Her voice was soft but clear. "Not to take him away, not to replace anything, but to share, to care for this soul who stepped into our lives and helped heal what we thought was beyond repair." Mia stayed quiet. She looked down at Alex, now lying between the 2 women, tail gently flicking, ears turned toward them like he, too, was listening to a silent proposal. "I think," Mia began, her eyes bright, "he would love having 3 homes." Nancy laughed. "3? Yes, 1 is ours, 2 is the hospital garden, and 3 is the heart of everyone he ever helped, people who never got the chance to say thank you." Sarah lowered her head, quietly wiping away a tear. "She's just like Lily at that age." Julia reached over and held Sarah's hand. She said nothing. But that simple squeeze spoke more than words, an unspoken yes to a new chapter. From that day on, Alex had a special schedule. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. He stayed home with Mia, reading books, watering plants, and listening to music by the window. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Nancy brought him to the hospital, where he served as silent therapy. Just lying beside patients helped them sleep more peacefully. Saturdays. Sarah picked him up for walks in the park, to visit the flower garden her daughter once planted. There, she would tell stories, and Alex would simply listen, just like he had always done with Mia, with Jonah, and with all the forgotten corners of the world. One late afternoon, Mia wrote in her journal, "You don't belong to just one person. You're a missing piece that anyone who's ever lost something needs, not because you're perfect, but because you know how to stay, even when you're hurting, limping, or worn down. I don't need to keep you for myself, because I know you're not going anywhere. You live in every heart learning how to love, all over again." On a quiet Wednesday morning, as Alex lay on the hospital floor beside the small bed of a child awaiting surgery, Nancy received a special phone call from a prestigious training center based in Colorado. "Hello, Mrs. Wheeler. We've been following Alex's story in the media. A dog once trained for aggression, who now chooses to protect. He's a one-of-a-kind case." The man's voice on the other end was calm and confident. "We'd like to invite you and Alex to our center for an in-depth behavioral study. With your consent, we'd conduct MRI scans, neurological reflex tests, and observe emotional responses under memory recall." Nancy listened in silence. When the call ended, she didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat down next to Alex, who was still half asleep, one paw resting gently on the child's pillow, his tail swaying steadily as if soothing a dream that hadn't yet begun. That afternoon, Nancy visited the park where Mia and Sarah sat beneath the big tree. Alex nestled comfortably between them, as usual. "What is it?" Mia asked, sensing something heavier in Nancy's mood. Nancy recounted the phone call. As she finished, Sarah looked at Alex, then exhaled softly. "It sounds interesting, but something's holding you back, isn't it?" Nancy nodded, eyes fixed on the swaying canopy above. "I think they want to turn Alex into a case study, a model example, a proof that training can be reversed or that instinct can override conditioning." "Sounds like they want to decode a miracle," Sarah murmured. Nancy turned to Mia. "And what about you? If one day they asked you, 'Why did Alex change?' what would you say?" Mia thought for a moment, then answered gently, "Because he was heard." Nancy smiled. "That's the best answer I've ever heard." That evening, as the three of them sat with Julia to discuss it again, Mia stood and walked over to Alex, who was lying beside the sofa. She whispered, "I don't want you to go back to places that smell like disinfectant, with scanners and evaluation charts. You've done enough, haven't you?" Alex opened his eyes and nuzzled into her palm, a silent touch that carried warmth deep into her heart. Julia looked at Nancy. "Are you going to respond?" Nancy nodded. "I'll write them a letter. I'm declining." "With what reason?" Sarah asked. Nancy's voice was steady, like a vow. "Because he's a gift, not a research subject. What Alex brings can't be weighed on scientific scales. It belongs in the human heart." The following week, Nancy sent the letter. But she didn't just decline. She told them a story. Alex is not a problem to be solved. He's a reminder that even those shaped by mistakes can still choose again, with love. If you're looking for formulas, I don't have any. But if you're looking for a lesson, come sit beside Alex. Listen to what he doesn't say, and look into his eyes, eyes that once held shadows, but still chose to reflect light. That Sunday morning, Nancy hosted a small reading event in Alex's garden. Children from the hospital came, one by one, settling onto wooden benches, some with teddy bears, some with coloring boxes, and some with nothing at all, just needing a quiet place to rest their heads against Alex's soft fur. Mia was the reader that day. Her voice rose gently, steady as a breeze. There was once a dog taught to bite, to bark, to scare. But one day he met a child who wasn't afraid, who didn't go silent. And together, they learned how to live again. The children didn't understand everything, but they listened closely, because it was a story about Alex, because Mia was the one reading, and because the dog's amber eyes, still wide open, had once been forced shut by the world, but had never stopped watching over it. Evening light spilled through the hospital's glass windows, casting golden streaks across the tiled floor like waves. In the small room that once held Mia's first moments of breathless struggle, everything was different now. No more beeping machines, no more rushing nurses. Only the hush of wind through leaves and the steady rhythm of a child's voice reading aloud. Mia sat on a cushioned chair by the window, the book open on her lap. But this time she wasn't reading. She was looking down, at Alex, curled up beside her, his head resting on her foot, his tail swaying gently. "Can I ask something?" Mia turned to Nancy, who stood nearby with a cup of warm tea. Nancy nodded, her eyes always open to the quiet questions children carry. "Can Alex stay forever?" The question floated out as softly as a breeze, yet carried the weight of a hope just beginning to bloom. The kind of hope children only give to what they truly love. Nancy sat down beside her, eyes still for a moment. Her hand gently stroked Alex's back, then settled on Mia's shoulder. "You know," she began, "some souls don't need to be told where to go or where to stay. They just know. They choose." Mia blinked. Alex chose you long ago." Those words, to an adult, might have sounded like comfort, but to Mia, they were something permanent, a vow with no signature, no certificate, yet deeper than any legal document ever written. She leaned down, ran her fingers along Alex's back, and whispered, "I choose you too." Alex didn't move, but his ears twitched ever so slightly, and his breath rose and fell like waves meeting the shore, staying, with every rhythm. A few days later, a small ceremony was held in Alex's garden, now a favorite spot not just for patients, but for hospital staff as well. There was no nameplate, no bronze statue, just a small wooden sign Mia painted herself, nestled between blooming lavender. A place for anyone who ever felt lost to sit and be heard, for Alex, who chose to stay, not out of duty, but out of love. Nancy, Julia, Sarah, and even members of the old investigation team were there. No speeches, no fanfare. They simply sat on wooden benches, drank tea, and spoke quietly of the chaotic early days. And in the middle of it all, Mia sat beside Alex, not doing anything in particular, just being there. Together. That evening, Julia and Mia walked home. Alex followed, his familiar limp unchanged, but his eyes brighter than ever, like they had never known darkness. As always, Mia prepared his bed. But this time she added something new. A small pillow beside his blanket, embroidered with the words, "Home is not where you're kept, it's where you choose to stay." Years passed. Mia grew older. She began to write, not for fame, but because there were too many things she needed to tell. About children who once stayed silent, about mothers who once fought with every breath, and about a dog who couldn't speak, but knew how to love, simply by choosing never to leave. Her first book was titled, "The One Who Stayed by Heart." The final page read, "We didn't keep Alex with a leash. We kept him with our gentleness, day after day. He didn't live forever. But the best parts of him, his unwavering loyalty, the way his eyes understood without asking, and the steady, deliberate steps he took, still remain, in every room where someone once carried pain. And when someone asks, 'Where is he now?' I'll smile and say, 'He's somewhere, resting his head on someone's memory, still standing guard, silently loving.'" Alex never really left. He was still there, by the window, in dreams, and in the hearts of those he once chose. Some stories don't need applause. They don't need grand endings. They slip quietly into the reader's heart, leave behind a hush, and from that silence, something tender begins to grow. Hope. Alex's story wasn't just about a dog trained to do harm. It was proof that anyone, even one shaped by mistakes, can choose again, can choose what's right, with quiet strength and an open heart. German shepherds, famous for their power, intelligence, and loyalty, aren't just born to follow orders. They're souls that listen, that love, that sacrifice, sometimes even more deeply than humans. And Alex's choice, to forgive, to protect, to stay, reminds us, no one is forever defined by their past. Like Mia, we can step out of the dark, not through magic, but through the unconditional love of a creature who speaks only through eyes that embrace your soul. If you ever doubt that the world is still beautiful, look at a dog who lies silently beside a stranger's bed, just to help them sleep. And if you ever ask, what can we learn from a dog? The answer is, learn to be loyal to what's right, and to stay with your heart.